There's a certain quiet to the sea before dawn, a rhythm that feels timeless, waves brushing against stone harbors, ships resting, ropes creaking softly. For centuries, the Mediterranean has been more than a body of water. It has been the heart of connection, of trade, of culture, of rivalry. And on its western edge, two rising powers were about to meet for the first time: Rome and Carthage. Before we drift into that story, whether you're here to drift off into dreams or letting this play softly in the background while you do something else, I'm glad you're here. Before we drift into history, tell me in the comments, what's one place in the world you'd love to see in person? If you enjoy calm history like this, a like or subscribe helps this series reach more gentle minds who love Rome's story as much as you do. Now, find a comfortable place, let your shoulders loosen, breathe slowly, and let's begin. In the middle of the 3rd century BC, the Mediterranean was a world of merchants, fishermen, and explorers. The sea itself was the bloodstream of civilization, a mirror that reflected the ambitions of every coast it touched. To sail its waters was to be part of something immense and ancient. To the north, the Italian peninsula had become a single organism under the rule of Rome. The Republic's legions had crushed their rivals, the Etruscans in the north, the Samnites in the mountains, the Greeks of the south. Every road now led back to the capital, where senators debated in marble halls and citizens gathered in the forum to hear the news of new victories. Rome's walls no longer confined it. They served as a reminder of how far the Republic had come. Yet for all its strength, Rome was still a land power. Its soldiers marched across hills and valleys. Its roads tied the peninsula together like veins of stone. But the sea, that restless expanse beyond sight, was something else. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea, but the words were more hope than truth. For the sea already belonged to someone else. Across the water, on the coast of North Africa, stood Carthage. Founded by Phoenician traders centuries before, Carthage was a jewel of commerce, a city of sails and spice, of harbors that never slept. Its ships darted between islands, their prows carved into shapes of gods and animals. To Carthage, wealth flowed from trade. To Rome, wealth came from conquest. One counted its success in coins, the other in fields won and enemies subdued. Two republics, alike in ambition, different in spirit, now faced each other across a narrow sea. Between them lay Sicily, fertile, beautiful, and contested. For centuries, Greek colonists, Carthaginian settlers, and native Sicilians had lived in uneasy coexistence there. Its harbors were stepping stones, its grain fields the envy of every hungry city. Whoever controlled Sicily controlled the central Mediterranean. In 265 BC, the city of Messana became the stage upon which fate first revealed itself. At the island's northeastern tip, overlooking the narrow strait that separates Sicily from Italy, Messana was both gateway and prize. Years earlier, a band of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines had seized it, killing its leaders and ruling as warlords. When threatened by the powerful Greek city of Syracuse, they appealed for help, first to Carthage, whose fleets anchored in their harbor, and then to Rome. The Carthaginian commanders agreed immediately, seeing the strategic value of holding Messana. But the Mamertines soon feared their rescuers more than their enemies and sent another plea, this time to the Roman Senate. Debate raged in the Curia. Some senators argued that Rome should not interfere beyond Italy. Others warned that Carthage must not be allowed to dominate the strait. For generations, the Republic's wars had been fought to defend allies. Now, for the first time, Rome considered war for position. After days of argument, a decision came. A small Roman force would cross to Sicily, the first Roman soldiers to fight on foreign soil. When the Carthaginian admiral saw Roman banners unfurl above Messana, he withdrew, uncertain of how far the new power would go. But retreat was not surrender. Soon Carthage returned with ships and troops, joined by their old rivals from Syracuse. The Mamertines' desperate gamble had worked too well. They had drawn two empires into conflict. No one imagined it would last 23 years. No one foresaw that a dispute over a single Sicilian city would reshape the Mediterranean. At the start of the war, the difference between Rome and Carthage was almost absolute. Carthage was a maritime empire. Its strength lay in its navy, in the skill of its helmsmen, and the wealth of its merchants. Rome was a nation of soldiers, its legions trained to fight on land. The sea was unfamiliar territory, but the Romans were nothing if not pragmatic. To defeat Carthage, they would have to become what they were not. They began building a navy. It is said that the Romans captured a Carthaginian Quinquereme, a massive warship with 5 rows of oars, and used it as a model. Shipwrights along the Tiber studied every detail, copying the design plank for plank. Within months, 100 new vessels were ready. To train crews, practice ships were built on land, where soldiers learned the rhythm of rowing as if marching in formation. They learned, adapted, and learned again. But Rome's greatest innovation was not a ship, it was a bridge. They called it the Corvus, the Raven, a long wooden gangway with an iron spike at its tip. When dropped onto an enemy deck, it pinned the 2 ships together. The sea became a battlefield of boards and shields, where legionaries could fight as if on solid ground. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, Rome tested this invention for the first time. Carthaginian ships, sleek and confident, charged forward to ram the inexperienced Romans. But as they closed, the corvée fell. Iron struck wood. Roman soldiers surged across, turning the decks into a melee of swords and cries. By sunset, Carthage's fleet was in ruins. 50 ships captured or sunk. Rome, for the first time, had won at sea. Rome's victory at Mylae stunned the Mediterranean. The unthinkable had happened. A land power had defeated the masters of the sea. In the markets of Carthage, traders fell silent as word spread that Roman farmers had become sailors and had won. In Rome, processions wound through the streets, but the triumph was tempered by disbelief. The Republic had taken its first steps onto an ocean it did not yet understand. Ships returned home, battered but afloat, their decks heavy with splintered planks and the smell of salt and pitch. The sailors, still unsteady on land, spoke of battles where the sea itself seemed to fight against them. They told of the Corvus creaking under their feet, of water sloshing over decks as they grappled enemy ships. To the Romans, these were stories of endurance. To the Carthaginians, they were omens. Carthage, though shaken, was far from broken. Its admirals reorganized, its shipyards rang again with the sound of saws and hammers. The city's wealth still poured in from Africa and Spain. It could build another fleet, and it did. The war was only beginning. For the next decade, Sicily became a chessboard. Each side captured towns, lost them, and captured them again. Fortresses rose on hilltops. Supply lines stretched thin. Carthaginian generals relied on mercenaries from Iberia, Numidia, and Gaul. Rome relied on citizens, farmers turned soldiers who fought for the Republic itself. The difference was invisible on the battlefield, yet decisive over time. Mercenaries could be bought, citizens could not. In 256 BC, Rome made a daring decision. Instead of simply fighting for Sicily, the Senate ordered an invasion of Africa itself. It would be the boldest gamble in Roman history to that point, a strike at Carthage's heart. A vast fleet assembled on the southern coast of Italy. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, all moving as one. Before sailing, the consuls offered sacrifices to the gods. Augurs read the flight of birds, the color of entrails, the shimmer of the sea. Every sign was favorable, or perhaps Rome had simply decided to believe it was. The 2 navies met off Ecnomus on the southern coast of Sicily. It was one of the largest sea battles ever fought. Nearly 700 warships, perhaps 300,000 men. The Roman formation, shaped like a wedge, drove through the Carthaginian line. The corvée slammed down, and once again Rome turned the sea into solid ground. By nightfall, Carthage's fleet was shattered, and the way to Africa lay open. The consuls Regulus and Manlius led their troops ashore near modern Tunis. For months, victory seemed certain. Roman standards rose above captured towns. Carthaginian allies defected. But success bred overconfidence. When one consul returned to Rome with half the army, Regulus remained behind with barely 15,000 men, confident that Carthage would soon fall. The city, desperate, turned to an outsider for help, a Spartan mercenary commander named Xanthippus. He reorganized the Carthaginian forces, trained them in disciplined phalanx formations, and taught them to use their war elephants to crush Roman lines. When the armies met on the plains near the Bagradas River, the difference was decisive. The elephants broke through the legion's front ranks. The Carthaginian cavalry encircled their flanks. By sunset, the Roman army was annihilated. Regulus was captured alive. The survivors fled toward the coast. When the relief fleet arrived to rescue them, it too was destroyed by storms. 200 ships sank. The sea became a graveyard. It is said that the waves near Sicily carried wreckage for weeks, timbers, armor, and the faint, tragic gleam of bronze helmets under the sun. Rome should have surrendered. Any other state might have. But the Republic did what it always did. It rebuilt. Citizens donated money and timber. Families who had lost sons sent younger brothers to replace them. Shipyards worked day and night. New fleets took shape from the ruins of the old. The Senate proclaimed that fortune could be broken by will. Carthage, however, was learning the same lesson. It had survived invasion, rearmed, and begun counterattacking in Sicily. The island became a wasteland of sieges. Entire harvests were burned. Towns were starved into surrender. The war had entered a phase of exhaustion, one that only a society with endless patience could survive. By 249 BC, after 15 years of fighting, Carthage scored a major victory at Drepanum. The Roman fleet was caught in a narrow harbor and destroyed, 90 ships lost. In Rome, despair spread, but it was a quiet, stubborn despair. No one spoke of peace. The Senate simply ordered new ships. The word surrender did not exist in their political vocabulary. Years passed. Sicily's fields lay barren, its towns hollow. Both powers were drained, their treasuries nearly empty, and yet neither would quit. In the end, Rome's persistence broke the balance. A new generation of wealthy Romans, merchants, landowners, veterans, offered to fund one last fleet with private fortunes. They believed that victory would repay the debt. The Senate agreed. Shipwrights returned to work. Forests vanished into hulls and masts. The new ships were lighter, faster, and no longer carried the cumbersome Corvus. They were designed not to imitate Carthage, but to outsail it. In 241 BC, the two fleets met off the Aegates Islands. Carthage's ships were heavy with supplies for their blockaded garrisons. The Roman fleet, lean and maneuverable, waited for the wind. When it shifted in their favor, they struck. Hours of ramming, boarding, and chaos followed. When the smoke cleared, Carthage's navy was gone. Its admiral was dead, its sailors adrift among the wreckage. There was no fleet left to defend the city or resupply its armies. The Council of Elders sued for peace. The treaty that ended the First Punic War was severe. Carthage surrendered all holdings in Sicily, agreed to pay vast indemnities in silver over 20 years, and promised not to attack Rome's allies. The Republic gained its first province, a new experiment in administration and taxation. What had begun as a defensive alliance had become the machinery of empire. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands were dead, entire fleets had vanished. But Rome had discovered something greater than conquest, resilience as an identity. From that point onward, endurance itself became a kind of faith. To be Roman was to outlast. Carthage, though defeated, survived. Its merchants rebuilt trade, its shipyards reopened. In defeat, the city learned caution and cunning. It would pay its debts, regain wealth, and bide its time. Among the veterans returning from Sicily was a general named Hamilcar Barca, who believed the war had not truly ended, only paused. At his side walked his young son, Hannibal. The boy was said to have sworn an oath before the gods that he would never be a friend to Rome. Few believed such oaths mattered. But history would prove otherwise. The sea between Italy and Africa grew quiet again. Fishermen returned to their nets. Traders reopened routes long closed. The wind carried no smell of smoke now, only salt and spice. Yet beneath that calm, both republics nursed their memories, one proud, one humiliated. Each believed the next war would be shorter, cleaner, easier. Neither was right. The First Punic War was over, but its echo would last for centuries. The lessons Rome learned, organization, persistence, and faith in discipline, would build an empire. The lessons Carthage learned, adaptation, patience, and hatred, would give the world one of the greatest commanders it had ever known. And somewhere in Spain, as Carthaginian traders laid the foundations of new colonies, the next chapter of this long rivalry quietly began. In the months after Aegates, Rome discovered that victory created as many questions as it answered. The treaty parchment dried on a Senate table, but ink alone could not turn soldiers into administrators or legion routes into grain schedules. Sicily would have to be governed, quietly, predictably, and with the sort of fairness that kept markets open and farmers sowing. The Republic, which for centuries had measured itself by courage on battlefields, now had to measure itself by regular delivery. Taxes counted in grain, courts that kept tempers from igniting, and magistrates who could read both contracts and human nature. In Lilybaeum and Panormus, towns that had seen banners change like seasons, the sight of Roman officials felt strange at first, less a conquest than a new habit forming. Weights and measures were checked, granaries inventoried, roads patched where siege engines had chewed them to ruts. Sicilian merchants, exhausted by 23 years of uncertainty, learned the rhythms of Roman paperwork and discovered an old truth. Predictability is a kind of peace. The Republic did not need to be loved if it could be relied upon. Back in Rome, the story of endurance became a sort of civic mirror. Parents told children that the sea had tried to drown the Republic and failed. In workshops where bronze was hammered thin as a leaf, craftsmen stamped tiny rostra, ship beaks into jewelry and brooches, a quiet fashion of memory. Veterans took to speaking more softly, as if loud voices might call up storms again. They preferred the even talk of accounts, harvests, and the price of timber, things that stayed put on ledgers. Senators, meanwhile, argued not over whether Rome should rule Sicily, but how. Some wanted a heavy hand, taxes high enough to pay down debts quickly and fund new fleets. Others counseled restraint, warning that burdens press people toward rebellion just as surely as hunger does. The compromise, as so often in Roman politics, was practical, enough to fill the treasury, not enough to empty the barns. From Carthage, ships still came and went. Defeat had not torn up trade by the roots. Carthaginian captains tied their vessels to Roman quays, paid the new dues, and kept their expressions flat. A merchant can swallow humiliation if the tally at day's end is in black ink. But under the arithmetic, memory kept its own accounts. Sailors on night watch murmured the names of lost admirals. Dock workers ran their hands along newly planed rails and felt the ghost of old crews. Carthage, a city that had once measured its power by how many shadows its masts threw at noon, now measured time in silver shipments, installments flowing north, coin by coin, like sand through an hourglass. Rome, too, adjusted to the mathematics of empire. The Senate commissioned careful lists, how many bushels Sicily could yield in a good year, how many in a bad, which towns could host winter garrisons without resentment, which roads needed paving to keep mule trains regular. Engineers, those sober magicians of the Republic, walked the island with measuring rods, set milestones, and mapped water. They had once drawn siege lines, now they drew supply lines. News from the countryside came back with a new texture. Where scouts once reported enemy movement, clerks now reported harvest dates, ferry schedules, and the demeanor of local councils. In that shift from panic to planning, the Republic discovered a second courage, the courage to be ordinary reliably, which is the quiet foundation of any long dominion. And yet, even as Rome practiced administration, the war's echo rolled on. Sailors waking in the night still dreamed of decks tilting like hillsides and the sudden percussion of a wave slamming a hull broadside. Legionaries, home at last, sometimes stopped mid-sentence at the sound of thunder, their eyes flicking as if to find the line of shields. Women who had waited half their lives for the sea to give back a familiar face found themselves listening, on windless afternoons, for oars that would never knock again against a pier. In Sicily, olive groves that had been cut for siege machines began to grow again from stubborn stumps. Fields scarred by trenches softened into furrows. You could chart the return of peace by the return of bees to abandoned farm walls, by children's chalk games chalked again on thresholds that had lain empty. A new smell came back to villages, yeast and smoke from ovens starting before dawn. Bread reclaims a world faster than banners do. For military men who had made their reputations in the crucible of Sicily, the end of the war posed an intimate question. Who am I when the drums are quiet? Some sought magistracies in the new province. Others retired to estates that had somehow grown while they were away, tended by kin and clients. A few grew restless, walking the edges of their fields at dusk like sentinels without posts. The Republic would soon find ways to employ such men. History always finds work for those trained to move mountains a spear's length at a time. Carthage, too, found work, elsewhere. The city's elders looked west to Iberia, where mountains stored silver as if hoarding moonlight. There, they believed, wealth could be rebuilt quietly, out of Rome's immediate shadow. The plan had a double logic: repay indemnities on schedule to keep the wolf polite at the door, and in the same motion, gather new strength beyond the wolf's immediate sight. Gold could both appease and prepare. In the libraries where Tyrian scrolls slept, ink the color of wine dregs, letters neat as stitches, Carthaginian scholars copied navigation manuals, lists of winds, and coastal profiles. The sea had betrayed them, yes, but it was also their first language. Cities that live by water do not forget its grammar. Shipwrights bent new ribs to keels. Apprentices learned the old words for rope, spar, and knot. You could stand on a bluff above the harbor and watch the old rhythm resume, a skiff nosing out, then a cutter, then a heavier hull, all answering the same long breath of tide. Rome watched, because Rome always watched. Envoys counted, asked, and when answers came, wrapped in politeness, asked again. But there was a difference now in Roman eyes, a steadiness that comes from having walked to the cliff's edge and back. The Republic had discovered something deep in its character, the conviction that problems yield to method. Storms drown fleets, build again. Our crews inexpert, train them. Enemies swift, change the shape of the fight. What had once been improvisation now hardened into policy. In temples where votive tablets hung, little terracotta hands, feet, and ships, new plaques appeared with simple inscriptions, for safe return. They were not triumphal, they were thank you notes to fortune, modest and exact. The people wanted fewer miracles and more schedules. In that preference lay a philosophy, though few would have called it that, a belief that empires are not thunderclaps but calendars. As the first year of peace turned into the second, the sea relearned its softer chores. Gulls argued again over fish guts on wharves. Net menders traded rumors across their knees. A Roman praetor posted edicts in a Sicilian forum about market days and loan rates. A Carthaginian factor wrote a neat ledger in a counting house that looked out on the same square. And if their eyes met now and then with a flicker of old rivalry, the numbers between them still added up. Arithmetic can lay planks where diplomacy cannot. Yet none of this, grain tallies, harbor dues, milestones, meant forgetfulness. Memory kept its shrine in both cities. Romans remembered the impossible sights, the sky full of sails before Ecnomus, the flat horror of water swallowing whole decks when the wind turned, the strange clatter of corvée locking two worlds together. Carthaginians remembered the insult of indemnities, the silence of shipyards that had once sung, the way the word Sicily now tasted like iron. And somewhere between account books and border stones, boys became young men with inherited tempers. A Roman youth, born during the siege years, learned drills in a field outside the city and felt a calm pride in keeping step with 100 others. A Carthaginian youth, walking a Spanish riverbank beside a father who measured hills with his eyes, felt the tug of a different inheritance. Patience sharpened into purpose. For the moment, though, the Mediterranean's face was smooth. You could stand at Messana's Strait at dusk and watch the last light sink between Italy and Sicily, two coasts like sleeping animals breathing in time, ferries crossed with the regularity of heartbeats. Someone on deck might say the sea had forgotten, but seas don't forget, they store. The First Punic War had ended. Rome had learned how to build beyond itself. Carthage had learned how to plan beneath loss. Between them ran a channel not of water, but of understanding, that the next struggle, whenever it came, would not be won simply by courage or cleverness, but by the patience to turn days into strategy. Peace, when it finally came, felt unfamiliar. After 23 years of alarms, the sound of silence was heavy, almost suspicious. The soldiers who survived the last campaigns returned home to find the rhythms of ordinary life strange. The hum of a marketplace louder than any trumpet, the squeal of wagon wheels unnervingly sharp. Rome had won, but victory had not yet learned how to live among civilians. In the forum, senators debated what came next. Sicily lay under Roman control, but it was not Italy. The people spoke Greek or Punic, worshipped their own gods, and counted time by harvests that obeyed the sea more than the Senate. How could such a land be ruled without becoming either prisoner or tyrant? The question had no precedent, and so, as always, Rome invented one. They appointed a praetor to oversee the island, a magistrate whose duty was not to conquer, but to manage. He would judge disputes, collect taxes, and guarantee the steady flow of grain northward. A garrison remained to keep order, but the legions were tired. Discipline now meant paperwork rather than swords. Thus began the Republic's first experiment in provincial rule. At first, Sicily was an equation without a pattern. Its cities had been burned, its fields trampled by armies. Trade trickled instead of surged. The Senate dispatched engineers to survey roads, to mend bridges shattered by siege engines. Surveyors walked the island with measuring rods, setting boundary stones where the war had erased them. From their work came something unexpected: maps. For the first time, the Republic saw its new possession not as a battlefield, but as a landscape of possibilities. The grain harvest of the first peace year was meager but symbolic. 2 convoys reached Ostia's harbor in autumn. The people cheered as if the ships carried treasure. In a sense they did, the taste of security. The war had turned the sea into an enemy. Now it began to act like a friend again. Yet peace, as the elders warned, has its own kind of turbulence. Victory poured wealth into Rome, and wealth poured quickly downhill. Silver from Carthage's indemnities and from Sicilian taxes fattened the treasury. Contractors who supplied the legions during the war suddenly had capital to lend. The old class of patrician landlords was joined by a new class of financiers, men whose patriotism jingled when they walked. Meanwhile, the small farmer, once the backbone of the Republic, struggled. Years of service had left fields untended, vines gone wild, orchards half dead. Imported Sicilian grain sold cheaper than a plowman's yield. Many sold their plots and drifted into the city. The streets filled with veterans seeking day work, carrying both scars and stories. Rome's population swelled, its politics grew louder. For every victory column raised, a new grievance found its voice. But the Republic absorbed discontent the way stone absorbs rain, slowly, without cracking. The Senate granted small plots of captured land to some veterans, staged games to others, and reminded all that hardship shared was a civic virtue. It worked, for now. Beyond Italy, the world watched the new maritime power with caution. Greek merchants welcomed stability, even if Roman, pirates did not. Carthage, however, watched with something darker than caution. The war indemnities were crushing. Each year, a fleet of ships left Carthage laden with silver to pay Rome's demand. The people called it the Voyage of Shame. Tax collectors combed the countryside. Merchants complained of empty purses. The army, unpaid, grew restless. Many of its soldiers were foreigners, Iberians, Gauls, Libyans, men loyal only to gold. When their wages stopped, loyalty ended. The rebellion began quietly, like rot under paint. A unit camped outside the city refused orders until arrears were paid. Negotiators delayed, tempers flared. Soon the camp turned into a siege. Towns nearby rose in sympathy, then in anger. Within months, the revolt spread across Africa. It became the Mercenary War, or as some later called it, the Truceless War, because mercy itself seemed to have left the earth. Carthage, drained of soldiers and hope, armed its citizens and recalled Hamilcar Barca, hero of Sicily. He took command with a calm that unnerved even allies. To him, this was not just rebellion. It was a test of whether Carthage deserved to survive. He moved deliberately, cutting off rebel food supplies, avoiding open battles until hunger thinned the enemy ranks. The rebel leaders, Spendius and Mathos, crucified Carthaginian prisoners to frighten the city. Hamilcar answered by capturing their men and nailing them to crosses facing the same direction, a forest of agony visible from miles away. It was barbarity mirrored, but it broke the rebels' spirit. After 3 years of horror, Carthage triumphed. The rebels were executed, the fields ran red then green again. The cost was unspeakable. Africa had been burned, but the city was alive, and Hamilcar's name was again spoken with reverence. Rome observed in silence. Officially, it was neutral. In truth, it was calculating. When Sardinia and Corsica rebelled against Carthaginian governors, Carthage could not spare troops to reclaim them. Rome intervened, first as mediator, then as occupier. The islands were annexed, their rebellion crushed, and Carthage was forced to accept another indemnity. To Rome, it was a strategy. To Carthage, it was theft while bleeding. This second humiliation carved bitterness deeper than the first. The peace that followed felt brittle. Carthage had survived the Mercenary War, but not unscarred. Its foreign possessions were gone, its pride was hollow. And yet, in the quiet that followed, a plan began to form. Hamilcar Barca understood that Carthage's salvation could not come from Africa. The land was exhausted, the people were weary. But across the sea in Iberia lay a new horizon. The region glittered with silver mines and bristled with tribes eager for employment or alliance. There, Hamilcar saw renewal. He convinced the Council of Elders to grant him command and set sail westward. His fleet, rebuilt from the war's remnants, carried veterans who still trusted him and families seeking fresh beginnings. As the ships disappeared toward the setting sun, Carthage watched in silence. No cheers, no hymns, just the steady beating of oars. The city that had once ruled the western sea now placed its hopes on one man's ambition and a boy at his side. Hamilcar's son, Hannibal, was 9 years old. The ships that carried Hamilcar to Iberia vanished into the western haze as if swallowed by the sun. Behind him lay a city tired of both victory and defeat. Ahead stretched rivers of silver and tribes who had never heard of Rome or Carthage. The journey itself was a statement that a people beaten on one shore could build hope on another. Hamilcar's first months in Iberia were spent listening. He met chieftains in river valleys, bartered for timber, and studied the lay of the land as though reading a new text. His army, hardened by years of war, built forts that doubled as markets. To the locals he offered protection and trade. To his men he promised payment not in coins but in future spoils. The land answered him with ore, silver that gleamed even in shadow. Within a few years, Carthage's coffers began to fill again. Each bar of silver that left the mines at Castulo or Carthago Nova was both currency and symbol, the debt to Rome shrinking, the wound to pride closing one layer deeper. Carthage could now send its annual tribute northward with the grace of a merchant, not the grimace of a prisoner. And the Council of Elders, once divided, now found itself unified by profit. While Hamilcar rebuilt abroad, Rome reshaped itself at home. The city no longer thought of itself as merely Italian. Maps hung in the homes of magistrates now included Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Every convoy of grain that docked at Ostia whispered the same lesson. Empire could be a routine. To keep that routine, the Senate refined its machinery. 2 praetors were now assigned to oversee overseas territories. A third handled disputes between citizens and foreigners in Rome itself, a new office born from the complexities of global trade. For the first time, Roman law began to bend around people who were not Roman. Engineers, released from war service, turned their skills toward infrastructure. Aqueducts reached farther, roads cut cleaner through hills. Merchants followed these lines like ants on familiar paths, carrying Sicilian wheat to Latin markets and Italian pottery to island ports. In taverns near the docks, one could hear Punic, Greek, and Latin spoken in the same breath. Rome's empire was not planned. It simply kept happening, one necessity at a time. But prosperity has a way of creating shadows. The veterans who had settled on small plots after the war found themselves competing against estates worked by slaves from Sicily and Sardinia. These slaves, captured by the thousands during the wars, tilled vast farms owned by senators and equestrians. Prices fell, small farmers folded. Some drifted back to the city, swelling its alleys and forums. The Republic was still strong, but its base, the independent farmer, was beginning to erode. The consequences would not bloom for generations, but the seeds were there, quiet as dust. In Carthage, the mood shifted from survival to ambition. Merchants who had hidden their gold during the rebellions now invested in new fleets. The quays that had once smelled of fear now smelled again of pitch and cedar. Scribes recalculated taxes, engineers dredged the silted inner harbor. Carthage, always pragmatic, learned to smile while remembering. Yet not all smiles are equal. Beneath the calm of commerce, a generation was growing up with memories of hunger and humiliation. Among them was Hannibal. While his father negotiated with Iberian tribes, the boy followed, watching, listening. He learned to ride before he could write, to cross rivers before he could swim. At night, he heard the old soldiers talk about Rome, not with despair anymore, but with precision. How they fought, how they built, how they never seemed to stop. Hatred, in the young, is often a kind of education. Hamilcar saw this and did not discourage it. He wanted his son to remember the price of complacency, but he also wanted him to understand patience. So he made the boy walk beside the miners at dawn, smell the metal, feel the heat of the furnaces. Empire, he said, was work before it was glory. By the mid-240s BC, the Mediterranean had entered a deceptive calm. Trade flowed, borders held, letters between the two senates were formal but polite. The treaties written after the war were obeyed line by line. It looked, from a distance, like stability. But stability is often just a pause in motion. Rome's merchants ventured farther west, buying Iberian metals through intermediaries who worked for Carthage. Roman coins began to appear in markets where Latin was never spoken. Every exchange, every handshake, stretched invisible threads between the rivals again. It was commerce as a prelude. The same sea that had carried warships now carried curiosity. Inside Rome's Senate, some began to speak of a Western policy. If Carthage had found new wealth in Spain, they argued, Rome should monitor it. Others replied that Carthage was exhausted, that the Republic had enough on its plate in Gaul and Illyria. The cautious voices prevailed, for now. No one wanted another long war, but no one wanted to be surprised either, so they watched. In Iberia, Hamilcar's success attracted attention even from his critics at home. He had transformed a defeated city into a rising power once more. He founded a capital near the silver mines and named it Carthago Nova, New Carthage. Its harbor mirrored the old one in Africa, circular, efficient, almost ceremonial in design. Around it grew workshops, smithies, markets, temples. The new city thrived so quickly that some citizens joked Carthage had sprouted a second heart. The relationship between father and son deepened through these years. Hannibal rode with his father's scouts, learned the geometry of rivers, the temperament of elephants, and the taste of discipline. In council meetings, he sat silent in the corner while tribesmen argued about tribute and allegiance. When he spoke, rarely, the officers noticed he spoke as if older than his years. One evening, as the story goes, Hamilcar took him by the hand and led him to an altar. There, under a sliver of moonlight, he made the boy swear that he would never be a friend to Rome. The words were simple, almost tender. But the echo of that oath would one day reach the Alps. While Carthago Nova blossomed, Rome's senatorial debates began to drift toward curiosity tinged with concern. Reports arrived from merchants about the new mines, about Carthaginian troops training inland, about fortresses rising near the Ebro River. The Senate filed these as information, not yet threat. But information has a habit of maturing. Censors compiled fresh rolls of citizens, consuls reviewed the fleet. In the forum, political rivals competed to appear vigilant without sounding alarmist. For now, peace was profitable. The Republic could afford to wait, to let its rival expand under observation. But somewhere in the calculation, perhaps unspoken, lingered the certainty that Rome and Carthage were not built for parallel histories. Two suns cannot share one sky. In 229 BC, Hamilcar died while campaigning in the Iberian interior. Some said in battle, others by accident, his chariot tumbling into a river swollen by rain. His death might have ended Carthage's renewal, but leadership passed smoothly to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal continued the policy of diplomacy and consolidation, building alliances through marriage and trade rather than war. Carthage, under his hand, appeared almost Roman in its efficiency. The Council of Elders, relieved to see wealth flow steadily home, gave him wide authority. Meanwhile, in Rome, a new generation of senators came of age, men who had been children during the First Punic War, who had heard their fathers' tales of storms and stubbornness. They regarded Carthage not as a monster, but as a fact of geography, permanent, inconvenient, and therefore to be managed, not destroyed. For a while, that realism held. It would not hold forever. Hasdrubal the Fair governed Iberia as if he were arranging a mosaic. Each tribe a colored piece fitted into pattern by patience rather than force. He built markets at river crossings, schools for interpreters, and walls that looked defensive but served mostly to mark where order ended. He preferred diplomacy to swordplay, perhaps because he understood that power which arrives politely tends to stay longer. Under his rule, Carthago Nova glimmered. Workshops rang with metalwork. Dye vats turned wool the color of sunset. Caravans from the interior brought salt, copper, and the first rumors of gold. Carthaginian silver coins, stamped with the head of Tanit and the prow of a ship, began to appear in Greek ports and even in southern Italy. It was the quietest kind of comeback. Prophet as prophecy. Hannibal, now in his late teens, watched, learned, and waited. He studied maps, argued tactics with captains twice his age, and rode out to inspect garrisons. Those who met him later would recall his eyes, not fierce but steady, as if they had already measured distance. He carried his father's oath like an ember kept under cloth. While Carthage rebuilt its fortunes in the west, Rome's gaze drifted east and north. Piracy in the Adriatic had grown bold. Illyrian kings harassed merchant convoys. Rome dispatched fleets, not armies, and discovered that diplomacy backed by oars could move borders without battles. In 229 BC, the first Roman intervention across the Adriatic set a precedent, the Republic claiming the right to protect trade wherever Roman goods sailed. A habit was forming, the kind of habit that makes empires inevitable. The Senate also busied itself with tidier tasks. Censors inspected aqueducts, recorded population growth, and adjusted taxes to the new provincial income. The city swelled, marble replaced brick in public squares. Temples once darkened by war smoke shone again under fresh limewash. Rome was learning how to look permanent. Yet beneath the surface of civic order ran small tremors. The rural poor, displaced by slave-worked estates, crowded into tenements near the Forum. Coinage flowed, but so did resentment. Bread and games, those old Roman anesthetics, began their long career. Peace was profitable, but not entirely peaceful. Back in Iberia, Hasdrubal the Fair negotiated a boundary treaty with Rome around 226 BC. It fixed the Ebro River as the northern limit of Carthaginian influence. The agreement pleased both senates. Rome could claim it had contained its rival. Carthage could claim official recognition of its new dominion. Maps were drawn, seals pressed, messengers toasted with wine. For a moment, paper seemed stronger than destiny, but boundaries are invitations to test them. North of the Ebro lived tribes friendly to Rome, south of it tribes bound to Carthage. Trade and rumor crossed more easily than soldiers, and each side accused the other of trespass. Even as diplomats smiled, scouts kept count. In 221 BC, Hasdrubal was assassinated by Exelt in a night camp, a knife quick as punctuation ending his careful sentences of peace. Carthage mourned, and then, without hesitation, appointed Hannibal commander. He was 25. The torch passed so smoothly it was as if the years had only been rehearsal. By now, both powers were older, wealthier, and less naive. Rome governed 3 provinces. Carthage controlled half of Iberia. Each had senators who remembered the misery of the last war, and younger men who did not. Memory restrains, pride provokes. The balance tilted on generational change. Rome's Senate spoke increasingly of security. Reports from traders told of new Carthaginian fortresses inland, of elephant herds being trained near the Guadalquivir. The cautious asked for verification. The ambitious asked for legions. In Carthage, similar debates played out in mirror image. Should they expand further north to secure the mines, or stop at the treaty line and risk stagnation? Every argument ended with the same unspoken truth. 2 republics sharing 1 sea is a contradiction waiting for grammar. Hannibal's first campaigns in Iberia were swift and clean. He secured the tribes his father had once courted, tested his officers, and most importantly, taught his men to trust him absolutely. He moved like water, never twice the same, always in motion. To his soldiers he was both commander and companion, eating what they ate, sleeping on the ground, laughing at storms. To his enemies he was already a legend of precision. Rome heard the stories and half smiled. Every generation produces its heroes, they said. They did not yet understand that this one would rewrite geography. Around 220 BC, for the first time in decades, both republics were prosperous at once. Trade hummed. Roads lengthened, temples rose. Messengers could travel from Rome to Carthago Nova carrying nothing but good news and be believed. Farmers in Sicily harvested grain without hearing distant drums. For a single generation, the Mediterranean exhaled. But peace built on rivalry is like a house built on sand. It holds until someone shifts their weight. In 219 BC, a small Iberian city named Saguntum, allied with Rome but lying south of the Ebro, asked for help against a neighboring tribe loyal to Carthage. When Rome hesitated, Hannibal acted. He marched, besieged, and took Saguntum after 8 months. The act was within geography but outside intent. The treaty technically had not been broken. Morally, it had. In the Senate of Rome, voices rose. The old words returned: outrage, security, destiny. Envoys sailed to Carthage demanding Hannibal's surrender. The Council of Elders debated through the night. When morning came, their answer was simple: We will not hand him over. And so the ink of one treaty dissolved into the blood of another war. As 218 BC dawned, Rome prepared legions, confident the coming conflict would be distant and brief. Hannibal, across the sea, prepared something no one could imagine, a march through the mountains into Italy itself. But that is a tale for another night. For now, the world stands at the edge of motion. Two powers balance like ships waiting for the same wind, each believing it understands the other, each about to learn how wrong belief can be. There is a moment in every long peace when the world holds its breath. Traders still sail, farmers still harvest, temples still echo with prayers, but underneath it all, something shifts. It is the silence before a storm that no one quite believes in. In 218 BC, that silence broke. At Carthago Nova, the city Hamilcar had founded, Hannibal Barca stood at the heart of an army that seemed to vibrate with potential. His soldiers came from every edge of the known world. Libyans and Iberians, Gauls and Numidians, veterans who had followed his father, and new recruits drawn by the promise of silver and glory. Before them lay the road north, a journey that would cross rivers, mountains, and memories. The oath sworn long ago beside an altar in Carthage was about to find its first echo in motion. When the first columns moved out of the city, drums kept a steady rhythm, but no one sang. It was said that even the horses sensed the weight of what was beginning. From the harbor walls, merchants watched the army pass and whispered prayers to Baal Hammon, unsure whether to bless or fear them. Hannibal rode at the front, bareheaded in the morning sun, a commander with the calm of someone who has already made peace with uncertainty. The route was long and cruel. He would have to cross the Ebro, navigate through hostile Gaulish territories, and find a way over the Alps, a wall of snow taller than any tower in Carthage. Behind him, the Council of Elders offered little more than token support. This was his war, his vision, his risk. To many of them, it felt like folly. To Hannibal, it was geometry, a line connecting humiliation to redemption. In Rome, news of Saguntum's fall had arrived months earlier. The Senate debated fiercely, but with an air of disbelief. Some called for immediate war. Others suggested negotiation. Even those who favored conflict imagined it would be fought far from Italy, in Spain, or at sea. No one conceived that an enemy could cross the Alps and descend upon the plains of the Po. While Hannibal assembled his forces, Rome prepared two armies. One, under Publius Cornelius Scipio, would sail to Spain to confront him there. The other, under Tiberius Sempronius Longus, would guard Sicily and, if necessary, invade Africa. It was a logical plan, built on the logic of the First Punic War. But logic rarely survives contact with genius. The army moved north, slow but deliberate. The Ebro River marked the old treaty line. Crossing it meant that war was not coming, it had begun. Hannibal ordered sacrifices to the gods, not for victory but for endurance. He knew the campaign ahead would test every measure of strength his army possessed. When the first divisions crossed, the morning mist clung to the reeds like gauze. Soldiers waded through waist-deep water, gripping shields above their heads. Elephants followed last, the water swirling around their flanks. By evening, the last wagon had rolled onto the northern bank, and the bridges were burned. The army was now committed to destiny. The tribes north of the river resisted fiercely. Hannibal moved with a mixture of diplomacy and brutality, alliances offered where possible, annihilation where necessary. He avoided sieges. Speed was his ally. Within weeks, he had crossed territory that had defied other armies for years. Every night, scouts lit fires on ridges ahead, signaling the way forward. Every morning, the army marched again. Beyond the Pyrenees, the land opened into forests and rivers that seemed endless. Autumn mists rose from the valleys like ghosts. Some Gallic tribes offered food and passage, others set ambushes. Hannibal moved among them with the precision of a negotiator and the cold focus of a tactician. He gave gifts, took hostages, and punished betrayal with the same steady hand. To his men, it seemed as though he could read the landscape itself, as if the rivers spoke to him. The Romans in Massilia, modern Marseille, watched from afar, sending urgent reports home. Their messages arrived too slowly. By the time the Senate understood the scale of what was happening, Hannibal was already approaching the Rhone. Scipio's army, still unloading at the southern French coast, barely missed him by days. Had they met, history might have ended differently. But fate has a sense of timing. and sometimes a sense of drama. Hannibal slipped away, heading inland where the river narrowed and the crossings were shallower. Roman scouts arrived at the empty banks to find only footprints and drifting ashes. The Rhone River was wide, cold, and fast, and the far bank was held by tribes who had no wish to see strangers march through their lands. Hannibal devised a plan as elegant as it was ruthless. At night, he sent a detachment upriver to build rafts from felled trees and hide them behind an island bend. At dawn, he feigned a frontal crossing. When the defenders gathered to oppose him, the hidden troops drifted down behind them, landing in their rear. Caught between water and fire, the tribes broke. By midday, the army was across. The elephants, nervous and trumpeting, were coaxed into the river by mahouts who swam beside them, singing to calm their panic. Some slipped on the wet logs, others balked at the current, but not one was lost. The men cheered as the last great animal climbed the opposite bank, shaking water from its hide. It was a good omen, they said. The gods were watching. From the Rhone, the march turned east toward the Alps. The mountains rose ahead, white and indifferent, their peaks hidden in clouds. Scouts returned with warnings of snow and ambushes. Local guides promised easy paths and led them into traps. Food ran low, discipline began to fray. Hannibal rode among the columns, speaking softly, reminding his soldiers that they were already legends in the making, that no one in history had ever done what they were about to do. When persuasion failed, he used fear. When fear failed, example. He was always visible, always first through the hardest stretches, as if the mountain might hesitate to harm him. One night, a storm tore through the passes, scattering tents like paper. Fires sputtered out, snow buried the trail. Men huddled together for warmth, their armor freezing to their tunics. But when morning came, Hannibal was already mounted, waiting for the sun to rise. He pointed toward the peaks and said, "Beyond these is Italy and Rome." The words carried through the cold air like a vow. The mountains waited like sleeping gods. Even in late autumn, snow lay deep on their shoulders and wind carved the ridges into teeth. From the last Gallic village, Hannibal looked upward and saw only white and silence. For most men, that sight would have meant retreat. For him, it was simply the next page in a story he had already begun writing. The first days were deceptively kind. Pine forests rose on the lower slopes, and meltwater streams crossed the path like silver threads. The men sang as they marched. The elephants lumbered through the trees, pulling down branches heavy with cones. But the air thinned quickly, and with it, patience. By the fourth day, snow began to fall, and the path narrowed to a ribbon carved into rock. One misstep, and a man vanished into mist. Local guides promised safe routes, but their loyalty shifted with every whisper of gold. Some deserted at night, others led the army into dead ends. In one pass, tribes ambushed from above, hurling stones onto the column below. Chaos tore through the ranks. Hannibal rode forward through the panic, spear in hand, shouting for order until his voice broke. When his horse stumbled, he rose and fought on foot, the snow crimson under his sandals. The attackers melted away, vanishing into fog, but the message was clear. Nature itself was not the only enemy. That night, the camp burned fires in hollows of snow. Men chewed leather straps when rations ran out. Some slept sitting, afraid they would never wake if they lay down. The elephants stood close, steaming like furnaces, their bulk a living wall against the wind. Hannibal moved among them wrapped in a single cloak, his breath a white ghost in the air. He said little. His presence was enough. 10 days into the crossing, the army reached the summit. From there the view was both magnificent and cruel, an ocean of peaks stretching endlessly. Behind lay hardship. Ahead, more of the same. But to the south, through a break in the clouds, they glimpsed what might have been plains, faint and golden under distant sunlight. Italy. The promise became a shape on the horizon. Hannibal gathered his officers on a ridge and pointed with his staff. "Here," he said softly, "we leave the land of men and enter the land of destiny. Beyond those hills lies the enemy you swore to defeat." Some wept, others simply nodded. In the thin air, the words felt more like prayer than command. Descending proved worse than climbing. Snow gave way to ice, and ice to mud. Paths vanished beneath avalanches. Pack animals slipped, carts shattered. When a section of the trail collapsed entirely, blocking the route for miles, Hannibal ordered his engineers to cut a new one. They heated rocks with fires and quenched them with vinegar, cracking them apart. It was the sort of improvisation that turned desperation into legend. The elephants moved last, lowering themselves cautiously, their handlers singing the same slow songs that had calmed them at the Rhone. More than half survived the journey, a miracle by any measure. Each step they took into the valley below felt like the heartbeat of history itself. When the army finally emerged from the mountains near the River Po, it was unrecognizable. Of nearly 50,000 men who had left Spain, fewer than half remained. Their faces were hollow, their clothes torn, their weapons rusted by snowmelt. But they were alive, and they had crossed the impossible. No one had ever done such a thing. The Alps, unconquered since the dawn of memory, now carried their footprints. The Gauls of northern Italy, astonished by the feat, greeted them as heroes. Many joined willingly, eager to fight Rome, whose colonies had pressed into their lands. The additions swelled Hannibal's ranks once more, the skeleton of an army growing flesh again. He allowed the men a few days to rest, then set them drilling, reforming units, sharpening discipline. The mountains had nearly broken them. Training would make them whole. Rome, meanwhile, received its first clear reports with disbelief. Couriers arriving from the north spoke of a Carthaginian army on Italian soil. The Senate dismissed it at first as exaggeration. Even when confirmation came, senators stared at one another in silence, as if trying to calculate whether geography itself had betrayed them. The Alps were supposed to be a wall. Walls, they now learned, can be crossed. Publius Cornelius Scipio, returning from his aborted expedition to Spain, took command of the nearest forces in Cisalpine Gaul. He had not expected to face Hannibal so soon, and certainly not in Italy. Yet there was no time to gather more troops. The invader was already moving. Near the river Ticinus, the two armies met for the first time. It was a small engagement, cavalry against cavalry, but its symbolism outweighed its size. Scipio, leading the Roman horse himself, charged headlong into the Carthaginian line. Hannibal countered with Numidian riders who feigned retreat, then circled back in a swirl of dust and hooves. The Roman formation broke. Scipio was wounded and barely rescued by his young son, also named Publius. The boy's courage would be remembered long after that day. For now, however, Rome had suffered its first shock. The enemy was real, skilled, and alarmingly close. Winter came early. Rain turned the fields of northern Italy to swamps, rivers overflowed their banks. Still, the Roman consuls pressed on. Sempronius Longus joined Scipio with fresh legions, and together they sought to crush Hannibal before he could gather more allies. They found him encamped along the Trebia River. Hannibal watched them arrive, patient as a sculptor before stone. He knew the river well, shallow enough to cross, but freezing cold in December. At dawn, he sent his light cavalry to harass the Roman lines. Sempronius, eager for glory, ordered a full advance without breakfast or fire. The legions splashed into the icy water, their armor numbing their limbs. When they reached the far bank, Hannibal struck. From concealed ditches, his brother Mago's men rose and fell upon the Roman rear. Elephants charged through the mist, their cries echoing like thunder. By midday, the Roman army was in pieces. Thousands drowned or froze. The survivors limped south toward Placentia. Hannibal, victorious, let the rain wash the battlefield clean. In the quiet that followed, his officers urged pursuit. Rome, they said, was weak and frightened, but Hannibal refused. His army was exhausted, his supplies thin. He chose rest over haste, understanding that wars are not won by single blows but by momentum preserved. They would move again in spring. As the year closed, fires burned across the Po Valley, not of destruction, but of camp life. Men mended gear, sang to chase away the cold, and stared at the mountains they had crossed. Behind them rose the white peaks, now distant and unreal. Some said they had dreamed it. Others touched their scars and knew better. The Alps were no dream, they were proof. Proof that determination, once set in motion, can move even stone. Winter eased at last, though the scars it left on men and land were slow to heal. When the snow melted from the foothills, Hannibal's army stirred like a creature waking from hibernation. Armor was polished, horses watered, and the long banners dried in the first warmth of spring. The elephants, survivors of the mountain ordeal, stood thin but proud. Their hides bore pale lines where ropes had rubbed during the climb. To the soldiers, they were living proof that endurance could outlast reason. Across the plain, Rome gathered again. New legions, raised in haste, drilled on muddy fields south of the Po. Every dawn, the centurion's orders echoed against the hills. Rhythm restored, fear disciplined into formation. Rome could lose battles, but it could not lose routine. In early spring of 217 BC, Hannibal struck once more. He moved east toward the Apennines, hoping to cross them before the Romans realized his intent. The passes were flooded by rain, whole slopes dissolved into mud. For 4 days the army marched through water waist-deep, cold as stone. Men lost sandals, animals sank to their shoulders, yet the column kept moving, one footprint at a time. When they emerged onto the drier Umbrian plain, the air smelled of grass again. Behind them, the mountains steamed in the morning sun, as if exhaling their failure to stop him. Rome's commanders debated which way he would go next. Some insisted he would turn east toward the Adriatic. Others believed he would march directly on the capital. The Senate's orders were cautious: shadow him, exhaust him, keep him from feeding. But caution is hard to maintain when pride is hungry. Hannibal's scouts found a narrow valley beside a long, mist-covered lake. A single road wound through it between steep hills and the water's edge. He studied it for hours, tracing the curve of the terrain with his finger as if drawing music from stone. Here, he decided, he would teach Rome the cost of haste. At night his troops took their positions, infantry hidden in the woods, cavalry on the slopes, slingers behind the reeds near the shore. Before dawn, a thick fog rolled down from the hills, muffling every sound. When the Roman army under Gaius Flaminius entered the valley, visibility was no more than a few paces. They marched in silence, hearing only the creak of wagons and the drip of water from the pines. Then horns sounded, one, then 100. From every side the hills erupted. Hannibal's men crashed down the slopes. The lake hemmed the Romans in. Orders vanished in the roar. Some soldiers ran into the water thinking to escape. Others fought until the fog turned red around them. Within 3 hours, the Roman army was gone. 15,000 lay dead, many without knowing who had struck them. It was not merely defeat, it was erased. Hannibal ordered the search for Flaminius's body but never found it. He stood on a ridge afterward, the mist thinning around him, and said quietly to his officers, "Rome learns slowly. We will teach slowly." When the news reached the city, the people wept openly. The forum filled with rumors. The Tiber carried fragments of broken offerings downstream. Yet amid the grief, a strange steadiness took root. Rome did not call for surrender. It called for organization. The Senate appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, an older man known for patience rather than brilliance. He studied maps for days and then announced a strategy so simple that it offended pride. He would not fight Hannibal at all. Instead, he would follow, burn supplies, block roads, and deny battle. The Romans called it cowardice. History would call it endurance. Fabius shadowed Hannibal like a shadow of drought, always near enough to sting, never near enough to strike. He saved the Republic by refusing to perform its favorite ritual, the frontal charge. Hannibal understood and even admired him. He taunted the Romans, burning fields within sight of their camps, leaving doors open in captured towns to invite pursuit. Fabius refused every bait. When his officers begged for battle, he said only, "Time itself fights for Rome." It was an idea new to their culture. That delay could be courage. And so the war paused in motion, the two armies circling each other through the hills of Campania like wolves testing scent on the wind. Yet patience wears thin when shared among many. The Roman people, impatient with Fabius's caution, replaced him with younger consuls eager for glory. They would find it, but not the kind they sought. In the summer of 216 BC, near a small town on the Apulian plain, Hannibal found the open ground he desired. There he arrayed his army in a crescent, luring the Romans into the center. But that field, Cannae, belongs to another story. For now, imagine only the heat, the smell of dust, the tremor of hooves waiting for command. The moment before collision, when two civilizations face each other across a morning that neither will forget. Far from the coming storm, ordinary life continued. In the alleys of Rome, children played at war with sticks for swords. In Carthage, traders counted profits from Iberia and pretended not to glance at the western horizon. And on the slopes of the Apennines, Farmers planted olives again in fields that had been battle camps the year before. History, even when it burns, leaves room for growth. When night fell on those same fields, fireflies drifted above the grass where armies had passed. The world, indifferent and immense, went on breathing. The stars looked down on both camps equally, bright points over ambition and fear alike. Peace, for the moment, belonged only to the sky. The plain of Cannae lay quiet beneath a July sun, its air heavy and unmoving. Cicadas buzzed in the barley, and the slow curve of the river Aufidus caught flashes of light like steel half buried in sand. It was a wide, open place, good ground for marching, good ground for dying. On the morning of the second day of August, 216 BC, two armies faced one another across that plain. Rome's forces, commanded by the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, numbered perhaps 80,000, the largest the Republic had ever fielded. Hannibal's army was less than half that size, a patchwork of Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and Numidians, held together by loyalty to a man rather than to a city. The Romans stood confident. After the disasters of the Trebia and Trasimene, they believed that sheer weight would crush fortune's whim. They had learned from experience, they thought. This time they would not be outmaneuvered. They were wrong, but they could not yet know how completely. The first light came softly, washing the sky in pale gold. In the Roman camp, soldiers tightened the straps of their armor and rubbed dust from their sandals. Breakfasts of bread and watered wine were taken in silence. Each man felt the heat already rising off the earth. Far across the field, Hannibal's men were doing the same, but more slowly, as if the day were not yet theirs to hurry. The Carthaginian commander rose before dawn. He climbed a small rise overlooking the field and watched the first Roman standards appear through the haze. To him, they looked like a tide, inevitable but predictable. He had chosen this ground for that reason, open enough for Rome's numbers to trap themselves. The wind, blowing from the south, would carry dust into Roman faces. A small thing, but Hannibal loved small things that tilted the balance of fate. He arrayed his troops in a strange formation, a crescent of mixed infantry at the center, Celts and Spaniards who would bend backward rather than hold, and on either flank, African veterans with long spears and tight discipline. His cavalry, led by Hasdrubal and Maharbal, waited on the wings. It was a design that seemed weak in the middle, but was in truth a door closing inward. When the Roman horns sounded, the noise rolled across the valley like a wave hitting cliffs. Their legions advanced in thick, close ranks, a wall of shields moving steadily forward. At the front, javelins flew, dust rose, the sun climbed higher. Hannibal's center began to bend under the pressure, just as he intended. The Spaniards gave ground, step by step, their curved blades flashing briefly before retreating again. To the Roman eyes, it looked like victory. They pressed harder, pushing the enemy inward, eager to break the line. The crescent became a bowl, and the bowl began to close. On the flanks, the African infantry pivoted inward like gates swinging shut. At the same moment, Hannibal's cavalry, having driven off the Roman horse, wheeled around and struck from behind. The trap was complete. Inside that narrowing ring of iron, 80,000 men tried to breathe. There was no space to swing a sword, shields jammed together, voices drowned in the roar. Those at the front were crushed forward, those at the rear could not see what was happening. When the sun reached its height, the heat turned the press of bodies into suffocation. Blood made the dust into mud, and the smell was beyond description. The battle had ceased to be battle. It was geometry, pressure, the mathematics of despair. For hours, the slaughter continued. Only the Africans at the flanks kept formation. The rest was chaos. Hannibal, riding along the perimeter, gave no further orders. He simply watched as the shape he had imagined in his mind unfolded exactly as planned. It was not triumph he felt, but a stillness, as though the universe itself had paused to acknowledge the precision of destruction. By evening, the field was silent again. 50,000 Romans lay dead or dying. The survivors, a handful of cavalry and scattered infantry, fled south under cover of dusk. It was the greatest defeat Rome had ever known, perhaps the greatest any army would ever suffer. When darkness fell, torches moved among the bodies like slow constellations. Carthaginian soldiers searched for comrades, stripped weapons, and tended wounds. Even the victors moved quietly, The scale of what they had done left little room for celebration. Hannibal ordered the dead Romans buried with respect, and the consular lictors' rods and axes were gathered into neat bundles, symbols of a republic that had just cracked. Some accounts say he slept little that night. He walked the edge of the field until dawn, silent, thinking not of Rome's fall but of what would come next. His officers urged him to march immediately on the city itself. The road was open, they argued. The enemy broke. But Hannibal only shook his head. Rome, he knew, was not a fortress of walls, but of will. He had broken its body, not its heart. At sunrise, a mist hung low over the plain, and crows wheeled above the silence. From a distance, it looked as though the earth itself had turned red beneath the sun. The Aufidus moved sluggishly, carrying fragments of armor and banners downstream. It was said that for years afterward, farmers turning their fields near Cannae found the outlines of shields buried beneath new soil, as if the land refused to be forgotten. Far to the north, when news reached Rome, the Senate did not collapse. There were no riots, no surrender envoys. The people wept, then returned to their work. The Republic had lost armies before, it would lose them again. But it had never lost faith in itself. The Romans would learn endurance anew, even if it meant rebuilding from ashes. And somewhere on that blood-soaked plain, Hannibal mounted his horse and turned west toward the horizon, the wind off the river cool against his face, already calculating how long Rome could bleed before it learned to breathe again. In the days after Cannae, Italy seemed to hold its breath. The summer air hung heavy with ash and rumor. Messengers galloped north, their horses foaming. Others rode south, carrying words no one wanted to speak aloud. When they reached the gates of Rome, the guards refused to open them until the tidings were confirmed twice. Even then, silence spread through the streets like smoke. The city that had marched its sons out in triumph learned the numbers in whispers. 8 legions destroyed, 50,000 dead, a generation gone. Mothers crowded the temples. Fathers searched the rosters posted on walls, scanning the names by torchlight. For many, there were no names, only the word missing. In courtyards, small lamps burned all night, not for the dead, but for those who might still walk home out of the dark. The Senate met through the night in the Curia. When dawn came, the senators emerged pale but composed. Their orders were brief. The gates would remain open. The city would be defended. No messenger would speak of surrender. Rome would live by the habit that had made it strong, organization in the face of ruin. Even in grief, the Republic behaved like itself. Temples stayed open, markets reopened within a day, and the praetors collected lists of survivors. Black veils appeared over statues of the gods. Priests carried out rituals to purify the forum. But there was no panic. The people understood that their city had been built by ancestors who had endured worse than sorrow, famine, siege, kings. Rome would endure again. When Fabius Maximus returned from Campania, he found the streets eerily calm. He rode to the Senate and offered no speeches, only advice. Fortify the roads, recall scattered garrisons, forbid the word peace from any official mouth. He reminded them that victory was often the child of patience. Some scoffed. Patience seemed too thin a weapon against catastrophe, but his steadiness anchored them. The Senate confirmed him as dictator pro tempore, giving him power without applause. South of the city, Hannibal waited for a surrender that never came. His cavalry ranged across the countryside, gathering supplies and expecting envoys to arrive at any hour. None did. Instead, they captured farmers still working their fields. When questioned, the men simply said, "Rome does not fall." He moved through Campania, hoping to break the alliance that held Italy together. Some cities opened their gates, Capua, Tarentum, much of southern Italy. Others wavered but stayed loyal to Rome, frightened of both victory and defeat. Each defection fed his army, but thinned his strategy. He could defeat legions. He could not defeat memory. Every Italian who remained loyal to Rome did so not because Rome was near, but because Rome was Rome. As autumn deepened, his victories began to taste of distance. He lacked siege engines to assault the capital. He lacked reinforcements from Carthage, whose Senate preferred to count silver in Spain. He had destroyed an army, but not the idea that produced it. That realization settled over him like early frost. While Hannibal wandered south, Rome reorganized north. New legions were raised from boys barely grown, and veterans recalled from every province. The city's treasuries were empty, so senators pledged their own fortunes to equip the troops. Women gave up jewelry. Temples melted sacred vessels for coins. It was less sacrifice than instinct, the reflex of a society that believed duty was the nearest thing to immortality. Fabius forbade large engagements. He instructed his generals to shadow Hannibal, to burn crops he might need, to rescue prisoners quietly at night. For months, his strategy seemed cowardly. In taverns, citizens muttered that the cunctator, the delayer, had turned Roman courage into caution. But each season that passed without another Cannae proved him right. Hannibal was winning battles and losing time, and time was Rome's oldest ally. The Senate declared days of thanksgiving not for victory, but for survival. Such gratitude was new, thanksgiving for merely being alive. It marked a shift in the Republic's soul. From now on, endurance itself would be treated as virtue. Beyond politics, life bent but did not break. In markets, the price of salt doubled, then tripled. Grain convoys from Sicily arrived under guard. Bakers worked by night to stretch loaves thinner. Families adopted orphans from lost legions, not out of charity but to keep the citizen rolls full. Old men took up watch duty on the walls, young boys carried messages to the camps. The city became an organism of collective effort, breathing through discipline. In the forum, storytellers whispered of strange omens, statues weeping, wolves crossing bridges, shields sweating dew. The augurs interpreted them not as despair, but as warning, that the gods, too, demanded endurance. Each omen became a reminder to stand firm. Superstition, once the refuge of fear, turned into a language of hope. Across the sea, in Carthage, word of Cannae arrived to shouts of triumph. In the markets, merchants poured wine into the streets, priests offered garlands to the altars of Baal Hammon. But in the Senate of Elders, debate split the celebration. Some demanded fleets and reinforcements for Hannibal. Others warned that committing too much might provoke a Roman invasion of Africa. The arguments lasted weeks. In the end, caution won. Supplies trickled north, but the grand army Hannibal needed never came. Carthage had built its fortune on patience, and patience now betrayed its champion. Hannibal understood the silence. Each unreturned message hardened him. He began to recruit from the very lands he had conquered, Samnites, Bruttians, Lucanians, men who fought well but dreamed of their own freedom more than of Carthage's glory. His army became a mirror of Italy's fractures, diverse, skilled, and slowly hungry. That winter, Rome rebuilt its soul. Public mourning was banned to stop despair from breeding. Citizens were ordered to light lamps each evening for the Republic's living soldiers. The small flames along the streets made the city look like a constellation turned upside down, a map of stars drawn by discipline. Every flicker was a promise. We remain. In the countryside, Roman garrisons fortified hill towns, securing grain for spring campaigns. Messenger posts connected the provinces with new roads. Even in defeat, infrastructure continued. Building was a kind of prayer. The people believed that walls rising from stone could lift spirits with them. And slowly, it worked. By the year's end, new legions stood ready, not large enough to win, but large enough to refuse annihilation. Rome had found its rhythm again, that heartbeat of law, routine, and collective stubbornness. For Hannibal, winter was a map of frustration. He had marched across mountains, crushed the mightiest army in the world, and now found himself circling the edges of a city that refused to acknowledge defeat. He sent letters home describing the opportunity. Carthage replied with accounting. He studied Rome's defenses and realized that even its silence had strategy. Every field he burned was replanted. Every ally he won seemed to waver within months. It was like fighting the tide with a torch, bright, heroic, and futile. On still nights, he would walk the perimeter of his camp and listen to the wind moving through the reeds. Some said he spoke softly to the darkness, as if trying to understand it. He was a soldier of motion trapped in stalemate, a man whose victories made him stationary. When spring came, both sides moved again, but the pattern had changed. Rome no longer charged blindly, and Hannibal no longer found easy prey. The Republic's wounds had closed over scar tissue, hard, ugly, and permanent. Carthage still held much of southern Italy, but the center of gravity was shifting back toward the Tiber. Rome had learned how to survive Hannibal, and in doing so had learned how to survive anything. The war was far from over, but the panic had ended. What remained was a kind of grim harmony. the predator pacing outside the walls, the city within watching, both waiting for the other to blink. It would take years for that silence to break again. Spring returned like a hesitant guest. For the first time in years, the Tiber ran clear instead of brown with runoff from panic-built fortifications. Rome's streets smelled of limewash and new grain. The city had survived its darkest year, and survival itself now felt like a form of victory. The Senate met daily, not to plan conquest, but to keep life predictable. Supply ledgers, road repairs, temple restorations. Consistency was policy. Fabius Maximus still guided decisions quietly from his bench, his voice dry as parchment, but steady. When younger senators demanded boldness, he reminded them that boldness had already filled too many graves. "Let time be our sword," he said. The phrase stuck. It became a proverb. Outside the walls, farmers returned to their fields under escort. Veterans plowed land granted to them as reward for endurance. In evenings, they taught children how to hold wooden shields and chant the old marching rhythms, not for war but to remember structure. The Republic's rhythm, the heartbeat of order, had survived its arrhythmia. Among those children drilling on dusty fields was a young man whose name already carried weight. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son who had saved his father at the Ticinus. He was barely 20, tall, thoughtful, and strangely serene for an age defined by anger. He had seen defeat close enough to understand its anatomy, and he spoke of the war not with bitterness, but with curiosity. How could such a man as Hannibal be stopped without becoming him? Fabius noticed him early. During inspections of the new legions, he watched Scipio move through ranks of recruits, calm but alive with quiet authority. When asked later what he thought of the youth, Fabius said only, "He listens." It was the highest compliment a Roman could give. Scipio studied both Rome and her enemy as if they were texts in the same language. He admired Hannibal's discipline, envied his adaptability, and began to imagine a Rome that could learn those traits without losing its soul. In taverns, he argued that the Republic must fight not just harder, but smarter. Few listened then. They would soon. While Rome rebuilt its rhythm, Hannibal's brilliance turned into burden. Each Italian victory trapped him deeper inside a peninsula that refused to yield. His army lived off loyalty, bought with promises he could no longer keep. Supplies came from foraging, not from Carthage. Letters to the Senate in Africa returned unanswered or delayed until useless. His allies in the south grew anxious, his Gauls restless. Victory had turned to routine, and routine is the enemy of wonder. He tried to summon Carthaginian fleets for reinforcement, but storms and Roman patrols broke them. He sent messengers through Greece to Macedon, seeking allies there, and Philip V replied with interest but little action. Across the sea, empires were learning that distance can be a strategy, letting time erode genius. Still, in the Roman imagination, Hannibal became a myth that walked. Children were warned that he might appear at night outside the gates. Mothers whispered his name like a spell. He was both a nightmare and teacher, the shape against which Rome measured courage. By 214 BC, the Republic's confidence hardened again. Consuls rotated without panic. Elections drew crowds instead of prayers. Grain ships from Sicily arrived regularly, escorted by rebuilt fleets. Carthaginian raiders who once prowled the Tyrrhenian now met Roman triremes and turned away. The navy, neglected since the First Punic War, had quietly relearned the sea. In the south, Fabius recaptured small towns one by one, careful never to risk all. Each victory was modest, a hill fort here, a bridge there, but the map began to change color. People who had once looked to Hannibal for liberation found that Rome, though stern, was dependable. Stability seduces more deeply than glory. A proverb spread through the ranks, better Fabius's delay than Flaminius's haste. The soldiers who repeated it often didn't know the names. They simply understood the rhythm. Wait, watch, strike only when certain. Discipline had become faith. Years blended. From 215 to 211 BC, battles came and went like tides. Herdonia, Nola, Beneventum, none decisive, all exhausting. Rome learned to measure success not by victory banners but by supply lists kept intact. A campaign that would once have lasted months now lasted years. War itself became a civic season, recurring like harvest and tax collection. The Senate opened new schools for engineers and scribes. Logistics replaced heroics as the core of ambition. Young officers who mastered grain distribution gained prestige equal to those who mastered swordplay. Rome had turned endurance into profession, and in this crucible of routine, the next generation matured, men who had grown up under Hannibal's shadow, who had never known unthreatened peace. Their calm was forged by necessity. Among them Scipio stood out, not because he shouted louder, but because he spoke of ending the war, not merely surviving it. Meanwhile, Carthage's eyes turned westward again, to Spain, where wealth shimmered but danger brewed. Roman forces under Gnaeus and Publius Scipio, the young man's father and uncle, pushed into the peninsula, cutting at Carthage's new heart. For the first time since Cannae, the balance tilted. Hannibal heard the news and felt both pride and dread. Pride that his family's name still commanded respect, dread that his country was fighting on two fronts while barely supporting one. In 211 BC, both elder Scipios were killed in battle near the Upper Baetis. For a moment, Rome seemed to lose to Spain entirely. But the Senate, rather than despair, appointed the surviving son, Publius Cornelius Scipio, now 24, to take command there. No one expected much. He was young, untested, and idealistic. But those who met him spoke of calm conviction, of eyes that seemed always to be imagining 10 years ahead. From that appointment would rise the counterweight to Hannibal. By 210 BC, Italy itself had settled into a weary equilibrium. Hannibal held the south, Rome held the north and center. Between them lay miles of scorched farmland and cautious silence. Ambushes still flickered like sparks, but the great fires were out. Both sides waited for fortune to shift. In Rome, the people no longer spoke of defeat. They spoke of duration. Every festival held, every road repaired, every harvest delivered was counted as a small victory. The city had grown used to living beside the idea of destruction, and found to its surprise that it could. And in the west, Scipio began to move through Spain with quiet precision, retracing his father's paths, learning from his mistakes, building alliances through fairness and vision. The shadow that Hannibal had cast was beginning to curve back toward its source. That year's winter came early, crisp and clean. Snow settled on the roofs of Rome like dust from a century yet to come. From the Janiculum Hill, one could see the whole city lit by oil lamps, each flame a fragment of determination. Fabius, now old, looked out over that view and said to a friend, "We are learning to conquer without moving." It was true. Rome had discovered the secret that would shape the rest of its history, that empires are not built by victory alone, but by the refusal to vanish. Far to the south, in the hills near Croton, Hannibal watched the same stars from a different horizon. He could almost hear Rome breathing beyond the mountains. For a moment he wondered whether he was fighting an army or an idea. The night gave him no answer, only the distant sound of waves, the same sea that had once carried him to Italy, the same sea that now waited patiently for his return. When the Senate named Publius Cornelius Scipio to command in Spain, many senators thought the decision ceremonial, a gesture of defiance after loss, not a strategy. He was 24, too young for formal command, and yet the Republic had run out of older men who believed in possibility. Grief had aged the Senate. Youth, it seemed, was its last resource. The people watched him depart from Ostia with modest escort and no fanfare. A breeze carried the smell of salt and tar as his ships moved westward, out beyond the familiar horizon. Those who saw him off said that he did not look back. That, perhaps, was the beginning of change, a Roman who faced forward instead of homeward. Spain in 210 BC was a land of smoke and silver. The mountains glittered with ore, and the valleys shimmered with heat. Carthaginian governors ruled from fortified towns, and Roman morale there was brittle. Two great commanders, Scipio's father and uncle, had fallen within months, leaving their troops scattered and leaderless. When Scipio arrived, he found the camps uneasy. Officers saluted him dutifully, but with doubt. A veteran named Laelius later recalled that the new commander's first act was neither speech nor punishment, but silence. Scipio walked the camp slowly, memorizing faces, positions, even the smell of the cook fires. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. "We have not been sent here to avenge the dead, but to continue their work. The dead are at peace, the living have duties." From that moment, the soldiers stopped calling him the boy. They called him an imperator. Scipio's first decision was audacious. He would strike not at Carthaginian armies but at their nerve. Carthago Nova, New Carthage, the treasury, shipyard, and supply heart of the entire Iberian command. To the Senate, still cautious, it seemed madness. To Scipio, it was arithmetic. If the heart stopped beating, the limbs would weaken on their own. He marched with 25,000 men and a small fleet, moving faster than the enemy believed possible. By the time Carthaginian scouts realized his direction, he was already at the city's walls. New Carthage stood on a peninsula flanked by a lagoon to the north and the sea to the south, secure, impregnable by siege. Or so it seemed. That night, Scipio studied the tides. Local fishermen told him the lagoon's water level dropped at midday when the sea's pull shifted. At low tide, the northern shallows became crossable, waist-deep, barely stable, but open. Scipio smiled and gave no orders until dawn. When the assault began, Roman forces attacked the main gate with engines and noise. Carthaginian defenders rushed to the walls, thinking the threat obvious. Then, as the sun climbed and the tide withdrew, a second Roman force waded silently through the lagoon from the north. Water splashed against shields, mud sucked at sandals, but they kept moving, invisible in the glare. By the time the defenders noticed, it was too late. The northern gate fell from within, and the city opened like a clenched fist. At sunset, New Carthage was Roman. The arsenals, the treasury, and the hostages of Iberian tribes all came into Scipio's hands. He ordered that civilians be spared, hostages released, and temples untouched. Mercy, he said, was stronger than terror. It was an idea rare among Romans, and it worked. The tribes of Spain, seeing his restraint, began to reconsider their loyalties. News of New Carthage reached Rome like sunlight through a storm. Crowds gathered in the forum to hear the announcement, and for the first time since Cannae, cheers returned. Senators who had doubted the young commander now spoke his name with careful respect. Even Fabius, slow to praise anyone, said quietly, "He has understood what we only remembered." In Spain, Scipio reformed everything he touched. He reorganized the army into lighter units suited for the hills, paired infantry and cavalry in coordinated drills, and encouraged individual initiative among officers, a practice Rome had long discouraged. He also cultivated his men's spirit. Each morning he walked the camp without guards, speaking to soldiers by name. He attended sacrifices, but his faith seemed less in the gods than in discipline itself. To him, piety meant attention to detail. He treated his allies with courtesy, often sharing meals with tribal chiefs. One Iberian leader, seeing him eat without ceremony from a wooden bowl, remarked, "This Roman fights like a god and dines like a man." The phrase spread, it became legend. Over the next 2 years, Scipio's influence spread through Iberia like a quiet tide. Victories at Becula and Ilipa followed, not grand annihilations like Hannibal's, but deliberate, methodical triumphs. At Becula, he divided the enemy line with feigned retreat and enveloped both wings, a mirror image of Cannae, but smaller, more controlled. At Ilipa, he changed the order of battle at dawn, placing his strongest troops on the flanks instead of the center. When the Carthaginians advanced, they found themselves surrounded before the day had begun. After Ilipa, the Iberian tribes began swearing loyalty to Rome, not because they loved it, but because they respected its clarity. Rome, under Scipio, seemed to have learned the language of persuasion that had once belonged to Carthage. In the captured cities, Scipio banned plunder, punished cruelty, and distributed grain fairly. He told his officers that Rome's rule must look inevitable, not accidental. It was administration disguised as mercy, and mercy disguised as strategy. Far away in Italy, Hannibal received the news with a long silence. His scouts had reported Roman movements in Spain, but he had underestimated the youth leading them. He studied the reports by firelight and saw his own reflection in the parchment margins. A younger version of himself, perhaps more patient, perhaps more dangerous. When one officer asked what he thought of this Scipio, he replied simply, "I would rather fight 10 legions than one man who learns." By 206 BC, all of Iberia was Roman. The Carthaginian generals fled to Africa, leaving the peninsula that had once financed their empire in enemy hands. Scipio stood on a headland overlooking the sea, the wind lifting his cloak. To the west lay the horizon where Hamilcar had once dreamed of renewal. To the east, across the same water, lay Carthage itself. For a moment he said nothing. only watched the sea as though listening to it breathe. Those around him understood the thought without words. The war that had begun on the coasts of Sicily, had burned through Italy and Spain, would now return to the place where it had all started. The sea between Spain and Africa had never looked narrower. From the headlands of Iberia, Scipio could sometimes glimpse the pale shimmer of the African coast, a mirage that seemed to beckon him home. He knew the next stage of the war would begin there, yet he did not hurry. Like Fabius before him, he had learned that patience could move faster than any fleet. Before Rome could cross the water, it needed allies. Scipio's thoughts turned to Numidia, the wide land of plains and hills that stretched west of Carthage. Its people were horsemen without equal, quick as dust storms and twice as unpredictable. Two princes competed for its loyalty: Syphax, who leaned toward Carthage, and Massinissa, young and ambitious, uncertain where his advantage lay. Scipio intended to win them both, or at least the one who mattered. In the spring of 205 BC, Scipio sailed to Africa under a flag of truce, officially to negotiate prisoner exchanges. Unofficially, he meant to meet the Numidian prince who could decide the war. The rendezvous was arranged in a neutral valley near the coast. No army accompanied either man, only a handful of guards who waited at a respectful distance. Massinissa arrived first, riding a bay horse with a silver mane. He was barely 30, lean and watchful, his cloak patterned in desert colors. When Scipio approached, he dismounted immediately and greeted him as an equal, not as an enemy. They walked together among olive trees, speaking quietly while the sea wind bent the grass. No one recorded their exact words, but legend says the talk lasted until sunset. Scipio spoke of Rome's discipline and its promises kept. Massinissa spoke of his people's pride and the uncertainty of Carthaginian favor. By dusk, the two men clasped hands. When they parted, each knew the alliance was sealed, though no treaty yet existed. Friendship, Scipio believed, was faster than parchment. That night, back aboard his ship, he told his officers, "We will have Africa when we have its horsemen." It was a prophecy disguised as a strategy. Back in Rome, enthusiasm returned with the wind from Spain. The Senate debated invasion but hesitated. Old memories of Regulus's disaster in the First Punic War still haunted them. Scipio's confidence, however, was contagious. He promised to bear the cost himself if necessary. Many nobles followed his example, offering funds, ships, even sons for the expedition. It was as though the Republic, weary of endurance, rediscovered its appetite for daring. While preparations gathered, Scipio trained his troops near Sicily. He drilled them not only in combat but in adaptability. Mixed formations, night maneuvers, sudden reversals of command. He wanted soldiers who could think. Observers wrote that his camps moved like organisms, breathing in unison. He dined with his officers but slept among the common soldiers, a habit that built loyalty faster than rhetoric. At Messana he met again with Laelius, his lifelong friend, and said, "The sea ahead is not a barrier but a mirror. If we cross it unprepared, we will see our own fear looking back." So they waited until every oar, every ration, every prayer was ready. In southern Italy, Hannibal watched these movements with eyes grown older and quieter. His armies were smaller now, their ranks filled with Italians who fought more for pay than conviction. Supplies came sporadically from the sea. His messengers to Carthage vanished into Roman patrols or storms. He still won skirmishes, still frightened entire provinces by reputation alone, but the purpose had thinned. The war no longer expanded, it merely endured. When news reached him that Scipio had taken Spain, he understood the pattern instantly. Carthage's heart was now exposed, its arteries cut. He wrote home urging immediate support and caution in equal measure, two instructions that could not coexist. The Council of Elders argued as always, delaying as always. When they finally acted, it was Syphax they courted, not Massinissa, and they sent envoys with promises they would never fully honor. Hannibal began to sense that the war had shifted into something larger than armies, a contest between two ways of thinking. Rome adapted by imitation, Carthage defended by memory. He could already feel which instinct would last longer. By 214 BC, the fleets were ready. Hundreds of transports gathered in the Sicilian harbors, their sails furled like wings waiting for wind. When Scipio finally gave the signal, drums beat across the shore, and the armada moved into open sea. The crossing was swift, the weather merciful. At dawn on the fifth day, the coast of Africa rose from the horizon, low dunes, scrub, and the faint outline of Carthage beyond. The troops disembarked near Utica and built a fortified camp before noon. Scipio's first orders were not for attack, but for courtesy. Local farmers were to be left unharmed, wells preserved, fruit trees spared. He meant to appear not as invader but as judge. Within weeks, nearby towns surrendered, offering supplies and hostages. Rumor spread that Rome's general carried luck in his cloak. Syphax at first sided with Carthage and even hosted its generals, Hasdrubal Gisco and Hanno, at his court. But Scipio, through a mixture of diplomacy and theater, turned that advantage. He sent envoys under the pretext of negotiation. They observed Syphax's camp layout, the construction of its tents, and returned with exact sketches. Days later, Scipio struck at night. Roman torches set both camps aflame in a coordinated raid that stunned the enemy. The sky glowed crimson. Shadows of horses ran like ghosts across the sand. When morning came, 2 Carthaginian armies had vanished into smoke. It was not battle so much as revelation that Hannibal's art of surprise had been learned and perfected by his opposite. The defeat near Utica sent shock through Carthage's streets. Merchants fled, temples filled with anxious prayers, and the council demanded that Hannibal return at once. Messengers rode south through the night, bearing orders wrapped in silk and desperation. When Hannibal received them in his camp near Croton, he read without expression. He had known this moment would come. He dismissed the envoys and looked toward the sea. It was time to go home. He began the long withdrawal with the calm of a man walking into destiny. His veterans, gray-haired now, followed without complaint. As the ships prepared to sail, he turned once toward the Italian shore. For 15 years it had been both battlefield and companion. "Farewell," he murmured. "You taught me everything except how to stop." The wind carried him south. In the autumn of 203 BC, 2 armies faced each other once again on African soil. Hannibal's, scarred, legendary, but diminished, and Scipio's, young, disciplined, shaped by the lessons of his enemy. Between them lay not just land but a decade of evolution. Carthage's old lion had returned to defend his city. Rome's new eagle waited to end the cycle. The world itself seemed to pause, aware that history had reached one of its hinges. But that story, the last meeting of genius against genius, belonged to the following year, to the plain near a town called Zama. Autumn dawned over the African plains with the hush of expectation. The fields near Zama Regia lay wide and flat, dotted with thorn bushes and pale dust. Far to the west, the faint blue of the sea marked the edge of the world. Between the 2 armies there was only wind, hot, dry, and impatient. Hannibal had returned at last. He was no longer the lean firebrand who had crossed the Alps, but a man of 50, seasoned, thoughtful, and carrying the weight of 15 years of motion. Scipio, by contrast, stood at 30, the mirror of his youth. Confident yet composed, eyes clear with purpose rather than fury. Each knew the other's name had become a legend whispered by soldiers. Now they would meet as men. Before the battle, Scipio sent a messenger asking for parley. Hannibal agreed. They met in a neutral valley between the camps, both unarmed except for the memories they carried. Their conversation, recorded later by historians, began not with threats but with recognition. "You are the first Roman," Hannibal said quietly, "who knows how to win." "And you," Scipio replied, "the first enemy I have wished to meet." They spoke of peace, of terms, of tribute, of how much blood the gods required before they were satisfied. Scipio offered lenient conditions if Carthage would abandon its foreign armies. Hannibal listened, nodding slowly, but when he returned to his officers he said only, "It is too late for peace made from weakness." And so the parley ended. The next morning, the earth would decide. Hannibal's forces numbered perhaps 40,000, veterans from Italy mixed with new recruits from Africa. At the front he placed his elephants, 80 of them, forming a living wall of muscle and tusk. Behind them stood mercenaries from every shore, and at the rear his seasoned infantry, men who had followed him since Spain. It was a mosaic of memory, the last fragment of a vanished empire. Scipio arrayed his army with surgical simplicity. Roman legions formed 3 lines, but with wide lanes between the maniples, corridors through which the elephants might pass harmlessly. On the flanks he stationed Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, restless and confident, facing the horsemen of Carthage. Behind the legions waited the reserves, calm, silent, a heartbeat held in muscle and iron. The air itself seemed to shimmer with tension. Even the birds were absent, as if unwilling to witness the end of an age. When the first horns blew, the elephants advanced, urged by handlers with fire and steel. The ground shook, dust rose like smoke. But Scipio's men held fast, beating drums and blowing trumpets to confuse the beasts. Some panicked, turning back into their own lines. Others blundered harmlessly through the corridors left for them. Where they broke through, Roman soldiers stepped aside, letting the chaos run its course before closing ranks again. What had been meant as terror became noise, terrible but ineffective. Then the Numidian cavalry moved. Massinissa's riders swept forward in arcs of dust, meeting their Carthaginian counterparts with speed that defied sight. The clash was brief and violent, a whirl of hooves and bronze. Within minutes, the enemy cavalry broke, pursued far beyond the field. The flanks were gone, the battle's spine was exposed. As the elephants scattered, Hannibal signaled his infantry forward. The first ranks of mercenaries charged, shouting in a dozen tongues. The Romans met them in silence, the steady rhythm of shields striking swords replacing speech. For an hour, the front lines swayed like surf, advance and retreat indistinguishable. When the mercenaries faltered, Hannibal ordered his Italian veterans to march through them, forming a new wall of steel. They obeyed, grim and efficient, cutting down their own allies to clear space. It was the last gesture of an army that had forgotten fear. Scipio watched from a low ridge, giving no orders. He knew that battles often collapse not from force but from exhaustion. When he saw the enemy center begin to tire, he signaled his second line forward and his third to wheel outward, forming a crescent that slowly folded around Hannibal's flank. The geometry was familiar. The same trap Hannibal had once sprung at Cannae, reversed now against its creator. Dust thickened, the sun dimmed. For the soldiers inside that storm, the world became a circle of noise and motion. The Romans pressed inward until space itself seemed to vanish. By afternoon, the shouting blurred into a single low hum, the sound of fate closing its hand. At the height of the struggle, Massinissa's cavalry returned from pursuit and struck the Carthaginian rear. The encirclement was complete. From hilltops, the watchers saw patterns of movement coalesce, red cloaks tightening like a knot around the darker mass within. Some said they could no longer tell dust from smoke, men from shadow. When the wind shifted, the field was revealed. Thousands fallen, the rest throwing down arms. Hannibal's command broke apart. He called the remnants to him, forming a small square of veterans who refused to yield. For a time they held a stone in a river of iron, until the pressure overwhelmed them. When evening came, the ground was quiet. The Second Punic War, 20 years of motion, fire, and endurance, was over. Scipio walked the field at dusk, moving between the bodies. He ordered the wounded cared for, Roman and Carthaginian alike. When he found Hannibal's camp abandoned, he did not burn it. Instead, he entered the tent where maps still lay on the table and stood for a long time studying them. Later he would tell his officers, "This man taught us how to win." And from that lesson, Rome would never stop learning. Carthage sued for peace within days. The terms were harsh but not cruel. Surrender of fleets, tribute for 50 years, no armies beyond its walls. The city lived, humiliated but breathing. Hannibal himself was spared, allowed to serve as magistrate in his homeland. He reformed finances, restored trade, and tried to rebuild what he had once defended. But peace was a language he had never fully learned. Within years, pursued by suspicion and politics, he chose exile rather than silence. Scipio returned to Rome in triumph. Crowds lined the streets, scattering flowers before his chariot. Yet those who stood near said he looked distant, as though his mind still lingered on the African plain. Victory, he seemed to know, is only another kind of burden. The Senate named him Africanus. He accepted the title without joy. Years later, when old soldiers spoke of Zama, they remembered not the clash but the quiet afterward, the wind moving over empty shields, the strange stillness when the shouting stopped. In that stillness, the Mediterranean changed shape. Rome no longer fought for survival, it fought for definition. Carthage, once mistress of the Western Sea, became a merchant city under watchful eyes. The balance of centuries had shifted forever. Some said the gods had chosen sides that day. Others said the gods had merely stepped aside and let men decide the pattern. Either way, the sea between Italy and Africa was no longer a boundary but bridge. Trade followed war, and soon Roman voices echoed in every harbor once ruled by Carthage. And somewhere in distant exile, Hannibal heard those echoes and smiled without bitterness. He had been the storm that taught Rome to build in stone. That, he might have thought, was victory enough. When the last smoke of Zama drifted out to sea, the Mediterranean exhaled. For the first time in living memory, no fleets clashed, no cities burned, no drums echoed across the coast. Fishermen ventured farther than they had in decades, and merchants unrolled maps no longer stained with siege plans. Peace had returned, awkward, unfamiliar, and heavy with expectation. In Rome, victory arrived like a sunrise after a long storm. The republic that had once trembled now glittered. Gold from Carthage's indemnities filled the treasury. Grain from Sicily and Spain flowed north. Markets swelled with new goods and new voices. The city expanded beyond its old walls, its streets paved with fresh stone, its temples crowned with marble. Every triumphal arch told the same story, that endurance had become an empire. Yet beneath the splendor, a quiet change was taking shape. Rome was no longer a republic of equals in hardship, but an empire of unequally shared success. The Senate governed as before, but its tone had shifted. Old families, enriched by war contracts and new provinces, began to see politics not as duty but as inheritance. Public service turned subtly into possession. Offices sought not for the republic's good but for prestige. The city's heartbeat, once measured in discipline, began to pulse with ambition. In the Forum, statues of generals multiplied. Citizens walking the marble avenues could trace their history in bronze: Fabius the delayer, Marcellus the sword, Scipio the conqueror of Africa. Each name was a story, and each story a reminder that greatness was now the republic's expectation, not its exception. But greatness has an appetite. To feed it, Rome needed new challenges, new frontiers. Peace, for a people built in war, felt strangely fragile, as though stillness might erase them. Across the sea, Carthage endured. Its harbors, once crowded with warships, now hosted merchant vessels painted in calmer colors. The forges that had hammered swords now shaped plowshares and amphorae. Trade, that ancient instinct, reawakened. Within years of the treaty, the city's markets thrummed again. Silver from Spain, spices from Numidia, glass from the Levant. The elders who ruled in the wake of defeat spoke in cautious tones. Every contract was signed twice. Every word weighed for fear of Rome's suspicion. Taxes were heavy. Tribute shipments left the docks on precise schedules, each cargo guarded by Roman inspectors. Yet beneath this watchful obedience, something remarkable stirred: resilience. Carthage rebuilt not with pride, but with precision. Farmers reclaimed burned fields, engineers dredged the old canals, and merchants mapped new routes that bypassed Roman oversight. The city's pulse steadied. By the 10th year after Zama, its treasury was again full, quietly, discreetly, dangerously full. In Rome, Scipio Africanus lived in retirement, surrounded by gardens rather than banners. He refused further commands, saying that peace must have its own champions. Visitors found him walking alone among olive trees, his face calm, his eyes distant. He corresponded with Greek philosophers, read by lamplight, and kept silent about his victories. When young officers sought his counsel, he told them not of battles, but of restraint. War, he said, is only the punctuation between centuries of work. They listened politely, but the city beyond his gates no longer spoke that language. To the new generation, war was not punctuation, it was poetry. In the Senate, envy grew like ivy around his name. Some whispered that he had grown too powerful, too admired. Others resented that he had treated Carthage mercifully instead of erasing it. They could not imagine that mercy might be a strategy. And so the hero of Zama found himself quietly isolated. When accused of financial misconduct, absurdly for a man who had enriched the Republic beyond measure, Scipio refused to defend himself. He simply left the city and retired to his villa by the sea. There, as waves broke against the shore, he looked westward and murmured, "Ungrateful country, you will not even have my bones." He was right. When he died, he ordered his body buried outside Roman territory. The man who had saved the Republic was buried beyond its reach. Meanwhile, in Numidia, the alliance Scipio had forged with Massinissa deepened into a lasting friendship between nations. The young king, now ruling a vast expanse of plains and oases, used his position wisely. He modernized his realm along Roman lines, introducing laws, councils, and roads. Under his rule, Numidia flourished. Its cavalry became the finest in the world, its grain fields fed both Africa and Italy. But prosperity, like victory, casts long shadows. Rome saw in Massinissa not just an ally, but a reminder of what strength outside its control might become. Diplomats praised him in public while measuring his borders in private. Carthage, too, watched uneasily, caught between admiration and fear. Its past and its future both wore the same crown. For 50 years, the treaty was held. Children born after Zama reached adulthood never hearing a war horn. Rome governed new provinces, absorbing cultures as easily as breath. Greece, Macedonia, parts of Asia Minor. Roads webbed the Mediterranean like veins, carrying soldiers and merchants alike. Latin words began to echo in distant valleys once ruled by kings. Carthage, bound by treaty, stayed patient. Its merchants spread east and south, its farmers turned Africa's red soil into wealth. Within a generation, the city looked prosperous again, too prosperous for Roman comfort. Senators visiting on trade missions wrote home of shining warehouses, crowded quays, and gold in the markets. Some spoke the old word again, the word that sleeps in all empires when envy wakes: fear. Whispers returned to the forum, that Carthage was building ships in secret, that its armies trained in the hills, that the old spirit of the Barca still burned. Most of it was rumor, invention, or perhaps projection. Rome, now master of the world, needed enemies to justify its vast machinery of readiness. An empire built on vigilance must always imagine a threat. Carthage, small and cautious, became the perfect ghost to haunt their peace. Massinissa, now in old age, began pressing his borders into Carthaginian lands, testing how far he could go under Roman favor. The city protested, sent envoys to plead for protection, to Rome, of all places. But the Senate answered with silence, watching like a physician who lets the illness declare itself. The peace that had seemed eternal began to feel like intermission, and far away, in the harbors of Carthage, hammers began to ring again, not for war, they said, but for trade. The sound, faint but rhythmic, carried out across the water toward Italy, where men who had once fought beside Scipio paused and listened, remembering how quickly silence can turn back into thunder. The Mediterranean of the mid-2nd century BC seemed unshakable. Rome's legions garrisoned provinces from Spain to Macedonia. Her fleets guarded sea lanes once ruled by Carthage. Merchants crossed without fear, and scholars in Alexandria now wrote their treatises in Latin beside Greek. Peace, it appeared, had finally become a habit. Yet beneath that calm, a new restlessness stirred, not of soldiers, but of senators. Peace had made Rome wealthy, and wealth had made Rome anxious. A state trained to survive struggle begins to hunger when danger disappears. So it listens for echoes, and the loudest came from across the sea. King Massinissa, friend of Rome, ally of Scipio Africanus, had grown old but not weary. Each year he pushed the borders of Numidia a little farther east, nibbling at Carthaginian farms. He claimed the land had once belonged to his ancestors. Carthage claimed treaty violation. Rome, sitting between, pretended impartiality but favored the hand that fed it. Carthage protested, sent ambassadors, and paid yet another round of tribute. Still the raids continued. Villages burned, cattle stolen, farmers displaced. The city's patience, disciplined for 50 years, began to crack. Councilors argued, should they defend themselves and risk Rome's anger, or endure humiliation forever? A few younger voices urged resistance. Among them was Hasdrubal, a descendant of the old Barcid line, proud, eloquent, and tired of submission. The Senate in Carthage debated for weeks. Finally, cornered by necessity, it voted to raise troops for self-defense. The decision was modest, almost apologetic, a single campaign to repel Numidian incursions. But it broke a clause in the treaty. Carthage had acted without Rome's permission. A legal detail, perhaps, yet empires often find their causes in detail. When news reached the Roman Senate, the reaction was mixed. Some dismissed it as a local quarrel, others sensed opportunity. Among the latter was Marcus Porcius Cato, austere, incorruptible, and relentless. He had visited Carthage as part of a diplomatic mission and returned disturbed by what he saw. Clean streets, warehouses full of grain, children laughing in schools. To him, prosperity was proof of danger. He ended every speech, whatever its topic, with the same refrain: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Moreover, I think Carthage must be destroyed. At first the words drew nervous smiles. Soon they became ritual, echoing through the curia like a drumbeat. Cato's argument was simple. A rival capable of recovery is a rival still alive. The Senate listened, half persuaded, half fascinated by its own dread. Fear, once useful, had turned into a habit. In 150 BC, the inevitable happened. Carthaginian and Numidian forces clashed openly on disputed ground. Massiniss's veterans, trained in Roman fashion, routed the Carthaginian levies. Thousands died. The survivors fled behind the city's walls. Massinissa claimed victory and sent envoys to Rome declaring himself blameless. Carthage sent envoys as well, pale, exhausted men pleading that they had fought only in defense. Rome summoned both sides to appear. Massinissa complied cheerfully. Carthage hesitated. But hesitation is guilt in the language of the empire. By the time Carthaginian representatives reached the forum, the decision was already forming. The Senate voted to send a commission to Africa, not to mediate, but to prepare. In public, it spoke of investigation. In private, it mobilized legions. The Roman fleet appeared off Carthage's coast before spring. Its sails glowed white in the morning sun, and the people on the walls watched in silence, remembering the same horizon from their parents' stories. The consuls delivered Rome's first demand. Carthage must hand over all weapons of war. The city obeyed. Spears, shields, catapults, even ship masts were brought to the harbor in an endless procession. 20,000 suits of armor, 2,000 engines, piled higher than the gates. When the last cart was emptied, the Romans made their second demand. The population must abandon the city itself and move 10 miles inland. Carthage would be destroyed, its harbor filled, its site left empty. The delegation stood frozen. One elder whispered, "Then we have obeyed for nothing." The people wept, then shouted, then armed themselves with whatever tools remained. The Third Punic War began not with declaration, but with disbelief. Rome surrounded the city by land and sea. Carthage, stripped of weapons, forged new ones from necessity. Plowshares reshaped into blades, chains melted into spears. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults. Workshops thundered day and night. Priests offered prayers that sounded more like oaths. The city that had once ruled trade now ruled desperation. At first, the Romans underestimated them. They expected surrender within weeks. Instead, Carthage fought like an organism too proud to die. Its walls, triple-layered and towering, resisted every assault. The harbor, thought sealed, produced sudden sorties of fire ships that set Roman vessels ablaze. Month by month, frustration replaced confidence. Among the attackers was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the great Africanus. Still young, he observed more than commanded, studying the city as his ancestor once had studied battlefields. He sensed that this siege was not merely a campaign, but a test of endurance between civilizations. Within Carthage, order somehow held. The council met daily in the temple of Eshmun. Guards rationed grain. Families shared cistern water by strict measure. At night, the streets glowed red from furnaces melting bronze. Children carried arrows to the ramparts. Old men sharpened stakes for traps. They no longer spoke of victory, only of honor. There were moments of grace amid terror. Neighbors sang hymns as they worked. Mothers whispered legends of Hannibal to keep courage alive. Some believed the old general's spirit walked the battlements, invisible but watchful. The city's heart, commerce, had become craft, invention, resilience. Even Rome, hardened by centuries of war, began to respect the stubborn flame it sought to extinguish. The siege dragged through one winter, then another. Plague touched both camps. Winds carried the smell of salt and smoke. When storms swept the coast, Roman tents collapsed, and Carthaginian sailors slipped through the rain to burn supply ships. Each victory was small, but in a world of hunger, small victories felt divine. Time itself slowed until the calendar lost meaning. The world had become a circle of waiting. And in Rome, the Senate read reports with growing impatience. The quick punishment promised by Cato had turned into a quagmire of defiance. They recalled Scipio Aemilianus and gave him full command, hoping youth might finish what politics had begun. When Scipio arrived at the front, he did not speak of glory. He tightened discipline, cut excess baggage, and rebuilt morale. He ordered trenches dug to sever the city from the sea, a wall around a wall. Day by day, the noose closed. From the towers of Carthage, watchers saw the ring of earthworks grow until it met itself, a perfect circle of resolve. Still, the defenders did not yield. Every assault was repelled, every fire quenched. Scipio watched with admiration, even as he tightened the grip. He had learned from his ancestor that mercy without victory was wasted, and victory without mercy left scars that outlasted memory. He would try to balance both, if the gods allowed it. By the third year of siege, famine began to speak louder than courage. Bread vanished, then barley, then weeds. Mothers carried empty baskets through the squares, praying for wind to blow grain back into them. Yet still the city refused to surrender. Carthage had lost everything but dignity, and that was enough to keep fighting. By the spring of 146 BC, the siege had lasted nearly 3 years. The Roman encirclement stood complete, a vast ring of timber and glowed red each night with the light of campfires. Inside that ring, Carthage flickered like a dying star. Its people no longer counted days, only dawns survived. The sound of hammers had faded to coughing, the scent of baking to smoke. Yet even now, the gates did not open. Scipio Aemilianus rose before sunrise each morning and climbed a nearby ridge. From there he could see the whole city, its harbors choked with wrecks, its temples blackened, its once white walls stained the color of rust. He rarely spoke. The soldiers said that when he looked at Carthage, he saw not an enemy but a mirror. Rome had been a city like this once, hungry, proud, unbreakable. In late spring, a strong east wind tore across the coast. Under its cover, Roman engineers launched their final assault. Siege towers rolled forward on groaning wheels. Rams pounded the western wall where the masonry had begun to crumble. For hours, the defenders hurled stones and boiling oil from above, their screams mingling with the roar of engines. At noon, the wall split open. The city's heart was exposed. Legionaries poured through the breach, shields locked, advancing street by street. Carthaginian fighters met them with desperation sharpened into skill. Every doorway became a fortress, every rooftop a trap. Women carried buckets of sand to quench firebrands. Children fetched arrows from the fallen. Even priests fought with kitchen knives. The battle was no longer a strategy. It was anatomy, house by house, heartbeat by heartbeat. Scipio forbade looting, ordering his men to keep ranks and move methodically. But as the day darkened, discipline dissolved. The city itself seemed to fight back, its narrow alleys swallowing legions whole. When night came, the flames rose high enough to stain the clouds. At dawn, the defenders fell back to the Bursa, the citadel that crowned the upper city. Its steps were steep, its summit crowned by the great temple of Eshmun. Inside gathered the last 50,000 souls of Carthage. Soldiers, families, priests clutching idols, elders too weak to walk. They built barricades from furniture and marble statues, stacking history against extinction. For 6 days the Romans attacked and were repelled. Each assault climbed a little higher. Each retreat left the air thicker with ash. On the 7th day, Scipio ordered fire set to the lower terraces. The flames climbed upward, fed by oil and timber, until the temple itself began to glow from within. Witnesses said the heat was so fierce that bronze melted and ran like water down the stairs. When the doors burst, the last defenders charged into the blaze rather than kneel. The priests threw sacred scrolls into the fire, shouting prayers lost in the roar. By evening, the roof collapsed. The sky turned copper, and Carthage was no more. The next morning, silence settled, a silence thicker than any victory shout. Roman soldiers moved through ruins where streets had become rivers of ash. Every step stirred ghosts. Scipio walked alone to the citadel's edge and looked down at the harbor, now a black crescent of wreckage. He wept openly. His friend, the historian Polybius, approached and later recorded his words. "A day will come when this city of ours shall likewise fall, and men shall ask where Rome once stood." He had conquered the unconquerable and found sorrow instead of triumph. When his officers came to congratulate him, he turned away. They say he spoke softly to the wind, quoting Homer, "The day of the destruction of Ilium will come." For Scipio, the ruins of Carthage were a prophecy written in fire. The Senate ordered the site leveled. The surviving inhabitants, perhaps 50,000, were sold into slavery. Roman engineers plowed the ground and, according to legend, sowed it with salt so that nothing would grow. Historians doubt the salt, but not the intent. The land that had birthed a civilization became a warning written on earth itself. Where the great harbor had once held fleets, reeds grew. The air smelled of brine and charcoal. Winds scattered fragments of pottery across the plains, handles of amphory, shards of glass, bits of mosaic that still caught the sun. Travelers who came later said the ruins sang when the wind passed through them, as if the city remembered its own voice. Rome returned home to a celebration that felt strangely hollow. Cato's prophecy had been fulfilled, but the man himself was long dead, and those who had followed his call now wondered what remained to fear. An empire that destroys its last rival must turn inward for purpose. The Republic, victorious, began its slow transformation into something else, an inheritance too large for its own laws. Years passed. A Roman colony rose eventually on the same shore, built by men who spoke the same language as the conquerors, but dreamed of trade, not war. They called it Colonia Julia Carthago. Markets returned, then laughter, then the smell of olives pressed for oil. The city lived again, not as Carthage reborn, but as a memory finding form. Sailors who anchored there in later centuries said that the sea beyond still glowed faintly at night, as though some member of the old world burned beneath the waves. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps history never fully cools. From Zama to the ruins, 100 years had passed. The Mediterranean had changed shape, its map now drawn by Roman hands. But the lesson of Carthage lingered in the minds of those who studied its fall. Empires, they whispered, are most vulnerable when they believe themselves eternal. Each victory plants the seed of its own decline, each triumph a memory waiting for echo. For the Roman world, Carthage became both a warning and mirror. Every general who marched east, every governor who ruled abroad, carried that memory like a silent companion. The smoke rising over Africa, the sound of stone breaking, the knowledge that nothing built by will alone endures forever. Centuries later, the harbor walls eroded and the tides rolled in again. Fish darted where warships once anchored. Seabirds nested in the cracks of old docks. The sea, patient and impartial, reclaimed what men had once fought to own. Waves whispered against broken masonry, erasing edges, polishing loss into beauty. From above, the coastline looked whole once more, the wound healed but still visible, a faint curve of memory under sunlight. And somewhere in that endless rhythm of surf and wind, you can almost hear two voices, Hannibal's and Scipio's, not in anger, but in understanding. Each had given his life to a vision larger than himself. Each had taught the other's world how to survive. Theirs was not a rivalry, but a dialogue carved into time itself. The ashes of Carthage were still warm when Rome began to change. The city had conquered its last rival, but in doing so, it had removed the mirror that had kept it humble. Now, with no enemy left to fear, Rome looked inward and saw only itself. The Senate met as it always had, under the same vaulted roof, but its air was different. The smell of sweat and leather had given way to perfume and parchment. The men seated on those benches no longer represented hardship. They represented inheritance. Gold, not grit, became the measure of influence. And in the quiet streets below, the people who had bled for the Republic began to wonder what victory meant for those without wealth to display it. After the Punic Wars, Rome's dominion spread in all directions. Provinces once distant became dependencies: Spain, Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor. Tribute poured into the treasury like a river, and from that river new worlds emerged. Temples of marble rose beside old shrines of stone. Villas sprawled across the countryside, their walls painted with imported colors from Egypt and Syria. Greek tutors instructed Roman children in rhetoric and philosophy, turning the sons of soldiers into scholars, or into orators more skilled in ambition than virtue. The city's markets overflowed. Spices from Arabia, silks from the East, glass from Alexandria, all found their way into Roman hands. Wealth transformed not only lives but expectations. The simple dignity of the early republic, built on service and duty, began to dissolve into appetite. To own became to exist. But beneath this glittering surface, something cracked. As estates expanded, small farms disappeared. Veterans returning from war found their fields bought up by patricians who had grown rich from conquest. They moved into the city, joining thousands of others in crowded tenements where rent devoured their pay. Once proud citizens became clients, depending on wealthy patrons for food and favor. The republic that had prided itself on citizens turned into one built on dependence. Each morning, crowds gathered before the houses of senators, waiting for handouts of bread or promises of work. The forum, once the heart of civic debate, began to sound like a market of petitions. Rome's greatness, built on unity, now rested on imbalance. One class owning everything, the other defending nothing but survival. The Senate saw it but looked away. After all, peace had always been bought with someone else's discomfort. They called it stability. Into this new world stepped men of ambition who understood what the Republic had forgotten, that soldiers, not senators, held loyalty in their hands. The legions that once fought for the state began to fight for the men who paid them. It was a subtle shift, invisible at first, but it would shape centuries. Commanders returning from foreign wars brought wealth, slaves, and prestige. They built monuments to themselves, held parades where spoils glittered brighter than gratitude. Each general promised reform, each vowed to restore the old virtues. But behind those promises lay the same quiet hunger, to be indispensable. Rome was breeding its future emperors in the language of the Republic. Among them were names that would soon reshape history. The brothers Gracchus, who sought justice for the poor, Marius, who turned legions into his own, and later Sulla, who would march those legions against Rome itself. But for now, their shadows only stretched across the horizon, long and patient. Writers of the age began to lament what they called the draining of the soul. Luxury, they said, had replaced discipline, eloquence, courage. Banquets grew longer, laws shorter. The Senate debated theater more than policy. Young men competed in rhetoric schools, learning to win arguments rather than causes. And yet, there was beauty in this decline. Art flourished, architecture soared, philosophy mingled with politics. Rome was learning to think as it once learned to fight, but thought, unanchored by purpose, drifted like a ship without sails. Cicero, not yet born but destined to define this generation's words, would one day write that Rome's greatness lay not in power but in memory, that its gods had given it the gift of self-awareness, just in time to watch itself change. From the ashes of Africa, Rome drew lessons it did not fully understand. It believed destruction had secured its eternity, yet the same act had set a precedent. If Carthage could fall, so could anything. Conquest became the Republic's language of reassurance, the cure for every anxiety. Each generation sought new enemies to remind itself of purpose. The cycle that had ended one civilization began again in another. Merchants still traded in Carthaginian ports, but their goods now bore Roman seals. Scholars from Greece taught Roman children that all empires fade. Their fathers ignored the lesson. In the Senate, old men recalled the sight of Scipio Aemilianus weeping over the ruins and called it weakness. They had never stood among the ashes themselves. Victory had made Rome universal, but universality demands adaptation. To govern others, Rome had to learn their ways, and in learning them, it became something new. The line between conqueror and conquered blurred. Greek art adorned Roman temples. Eastern gods found altars beside Jupiter's. Cultural exchange became both enrichment and erosion. Each borrowed word, each imported custom was a quiet surrender of identity. The city was no longer a republic of farmers defending their soil. It was the capital of an empire defending its idea of itself. And ideas, unlike armies, are hardest to command. At night, Rome glowed like a constellation turned inward. Oil lamps burned along the Via Sacra. Laughter drifted from taverns. The Tiber reflected the light of 1,000 hearths. The city looked eternal. But eternity, like marble, cracks from within before it breaks from without. In that restless glow, poets began to sense the rhythm of change. They wrote of ghosts walking the forum, of forgotten virtues whispering through colonnades. The empire had achieved everything it desired, except stillness. Its peace was motion slowed, not stopped. And far beyond the city's reach, in provinces once foreign, new hearts beat to the rhythm of Rome's laws, not its spirit. They obeyed, but they did not belong. The world was unified, yet unity had begun to feel like distance. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome's peace had become a performance. The city still held elections, the Senate still debated, the people still cheered in the forum, yet something invisible had shifted. The words were the same, but the meanings had hollowed out. The Republic, once a chorus of citizens, had become an audience watching its own reflection. The divide between rich and poor widened like a fault line beneath marble floors. Villas glittered on the hills, while tenements leaned into each other below. In the countryside, vast estates worked by slaves replaced the patchwork of family farms that had once defined Roman identity. The citizens who had defended the Republic now drifted toward the city, rootless and restless, waiting for someone to speak for them. That voice came at first not from generals or kings, but from two brothers, idealists born into privilege, yet stirred by the sight of what their world had become. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was the elder, a soldier and scholar with the calm conviction of a man who believed fairness was possible. He had seen the empire's expanse firsthand, serving in Spain among men who owned nothing but their courage. When he returned to Rome, he saw those same men wandering the streets without work or land. It was as if victory had replaced them. In 133 BC, Tiberius proposed a simple law: to limit the amount of public land any citizen could hold and to redistribute the rest to veterans and the poor. It was a return to old principles, not a revolution. Yet in a city grown accustomed to inequality, fairness felt like a threat. The Senate resisted. They accused him of ambition, of seeking power beyond custom. He appealed to the people directly, an act both legal and unprecedented. Crowds filled the forum, cheering his words as he spoke of forgotten citizens, of justice buried under luxury. For the first time in centuries, the Republic heard its own conscience aloud. But power never yields to conscience willingly. During a vote on his reform, violence erupted. Senators armed with clubs and chair legs stormed the assembly. Tiberius fell under the blows, his body left broken among the stones of the city he had tried to heal. Rome had witnessed its first political murder. The reform passed anyway, in fragments, carried by the force of his martyrdom. But the silence that followed was different, not peaceful, but tense. A boundary had been crossed. Disagreement had turned to blood. 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus, the younger brother, took up his cause. Where Tiberius had been gentle in persuasion, Gaius was fire-given voice. He spoke not only of land, but of dignity, of food for the hungry, of citizenship for allies, of accountability for governors who plundered the provinces. He was eloquent, magnetic, and unstoppable. Crowds followed him through the streets like a tide. He passed laws to sell grain at reduced prices, built new colonies to resettle the poor, and proposed extending rights to Italians long treated as tools of war. Each success widened his circle of enemies. To the Senate, he was no longer a reformer, he was a storm. When the Senate declared a state of emergency, Gaius and his supporters gathered on the Aventine Hill, refusing to disperse. What happened next blurred the line between defense and slaughter. Soldiers surrounded them. Fighting broke out. Gaius fled to a grove near the river, where he ordered a loyal slave to take his life before the soldiers could. His body was found at dawn. The city that had once prided itself on civil debate now solved disagreement with legions. And in the silence that followed his death, the Republic itself began to tremble. In life, the Gracchi had been accused of ambition. In death, they became symbols. Their names whispered through every tavern and barracks, spoken by men who had nothing but hope. To the poor, they were saints. To the Senate, they were warnings. Their reforms lingered half-finished, but their example endured, proof that one could challenge the machine of power and for a moment make it hesitate. Rome did not collapse after them. The streets were cleaned, the laws recorded, the games resumed. Yet nothing was quite the same. Violence had entered the political vocabulary. Every law proposed thereafter carried the ghost of consequence. The city had learned a dangerous lesson, that the people could move as one, and that fear could answer them. From that tension would rise men who promised safety through control, the first quiet steps toward tyranny made in the name of stability. After the deaths of the Gracchi, Rome drifted between grief and denial. No one spoke of reform, but no one forgot it. Senators built higher walls around their gardens. The poor filled the slums nearer the river. Each side learned to mistrust the other, each waiting for the next spark. Outside the city, wars continued, not of survival, but of expansion. Rome fought in the east, in Gaul and the deserts of North Africa again. Victory was routine, and routine dulled the senses. The Republic seemed immortal, yet its pulse faltered unseen. Philosophers from Greece taught moderation, orators preached unity. But words cannot mend hunger. The crowd's cheers grew louder each year. not from joy, but from exhaustion. In the arenas, the first gladiatorial games expanded, violence turned spectacle, blood made entertainment. The Republic was learning to distract itself from the tremors beneath its marble. In the Forum, an old senator once pointed to the rostra where Tiberius had fallen and said to his student, "That is where Rome began to die." The student laughed, thinking him dramatic. But years later, when civil war came, he remembered those words. History does not always collapse in noise. Sometimes it thinks, like gold stretched too far. Each generation believes itself stable because the walls still stand, but decay moves quietly, brick by brick beneath the frescoes. The Republic had not fallen, yet its reflection had begun to ripple. After the deaths of the Gracchi, Rome learned to live with unease. The streets were swept, the forums repaved, the ceremonies performed as always. Yet behind the rituals, mistrust lingered. The people no longer looked to the Senate for guidance. The Senate no longer trusted the people with power. The Republic endured not through harmony, but through habit. It was during this silence that new men rose, soldiers more than statesmen, pragmatists born from the discipline of war rather than the patience of law. Their names would come to define the century: Marius and Sulla. Between them lay the bridge from republic to empire, built not in triumph but in exhaustion. Gaius Marius came from humble beginnings, a man of the people who climbed through the ranks of command by skill and will alone. He fought in Africa under Scipio Aemilianus, learning the art of endurance that had once saved Rome. But where Scipio sought honor, Marius sought function. He saw that the Republic's army, composed of landowners, could no longer sustain its wars. The poor filled the city, willing but unqualified to serve. Marius changed that. He opened recruitment to those without property, promising pay, plunder, and pension. For the first time, a Roman soldier fought not for his farm, but for his general. It was practical, even compassionate. It was also the quietest revolution in Roman history. His legions adored him. He won victories in North Africa, crushed invaders from the north, and returned to Rome as the savior of the state. But a state that needs saving begins to forget how to save itself. Each triumph strengthened his image, not the Republic's, and in the applause of the crowd, the Senate felt its own authority dissolve. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was everything Marius was not: aristocratic, cultured, dangerously patient. He, too, had fought under Marius, learning both warfare and ambition. Where Marius embodied energy, Sulla embodied calculation. He believed the Republic could survive only through order, his order. Their rivalry began as politics, then hardened into ideology, and finally into war. When Sulla was given command against the Eastern king Mithridates, Marius used influence to have it revoked. Sulla's response changed history. He marched his legions on Rome itself. It was the first time Roman soldiers fought under Roman banners against Rome. The sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium, had been crossed by steel. Streets that once echoed with merchants' cries filled with the sound of battle. Temples burned, senators fled. When the fighting ended, Sulla stood victorious, a general ruling by decree, the Republic's laws suspended by necessity. He called it restoration. He meant control. Sulla did not declare himself king. He declared himself dictator for reform, an echo of old offices twisted to new scale. He rewrote the Constitution, expanded the Senate, and purged his enemies through lists posted in the Forum. Names once spoken in debate became targets. Those who opposed him vanished. Their estates were sold to fund the state. The city moved on, as cities do, adapting to the weight of fear. And yet Sulla was not without vision. He repaired temples, restored finances, enforced discipline in the courts. He seemed to believe he could sculpt morality from legislation. But laws cannot change hearts. After 4 years, he resigned voluntarily, walking away from power to die quietly by the sea. Rome watched in disbelief. A man who had seized the world's greatest city by force simply released it. Perhaps even he had glimpsed what came next. What remained after Sulla was not peace, but precedent. Generals had learned that armies could shape politics. Citizens had learned that loyalty could be bought with coin and charisma. The Senate, weakened by fear, clung to forms that no longer carried meaning. The Republic's body lived, but its pulse no longer belonged to its heart. In the years that followed, familiar patterns repeated with new faces. Pompey, the brilliant commander; Crassus, the wealthy opportunist; and a young patrician named Gaius Julius Caesar, charming, ambitious, and endlessly patient. Together they would form a partnership that would break the Republic completely. But that belongs to the next story. For now, Rome stood at the edge of transition, not falling, not rising, simply pausing between identities. By the end of the 1st century BC, the Mediterranean world had become one organism, breathing Roman law, speaking Latin prayers, paying Roman taxes. The citizens who once saw themselves as guardians of freedom now saw themselves as heirs of destiny. Freedom had turned into responsibility, and responsibility into empire. Writers looked back to older times and wondered when the shift had occurred. Some blamed luxury, others ambition. A few blamed the gods for favoring mortals too much. But most understood the truth whispered across every century, that greatness left unchecked becomes gravity, and gravity always pulls inward toward a single point of power. The Republic had survived Carthage, endured Hannibal, and conquered half the world. It could not survive itself. As night fell over the Forum, torches flickered against marble columns. The statues of heroes, Camillus, Fabius, Scipio, stood motionless in the soft light, their shadows stretching across empty courtyards. Beyond the Tiber, villas glowed with feasts and laughter. Somewhere, in a narrow street, a poet recited verses about destiny. Somewhere else, a senator whispered a new name rising in the provinces. The city seemed eternal, unshaken, serene. Yet history, like the sea, gathers strength in silence. Beneath the calm, tides were moving, tides that would one day carry Rome from republic to empire, from marble debates to the rule of a single man. And when that man finally came, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and the world tilted toward monarchy once more, some said they heard an echo in the wind, as though the ghosts of Carthage were laughing softly, reminding Rome that every empire carries the seed of its own ending. Whether you've listened to this story while drifting to sleep, or let it play softly in the background as your day unfolded, I'm glad you've been here. From the dust of Carthage to the marble of Rome, we've traveled through centuries of endurance, ambition, and quiet transformation. If you'd like to stay in this calm corner of history, you can continue through the playlist. The next chapter follows naturally into the rise of Caesar, calm history. Thank you for joining this journey, and until next time, sleep well and dream of the ancient world at peace once more.